At a suburban village under the territory of Viscount Roses, the 15-year-old protagonist, Rio, was standing outside his house when his mother called out to him. She told him to get ready and reminded him not to be rude to Rakdoi. Rio replied that he was only being taught properly and already knew how to behave. His mother was still worried because he was a stubborn child. She then handed him a gift meant for Rakdoi and reminded him to make sure it was delivered. Rio took the gift and prepared to leave. As he walked away, Rio reflected on how his village was surrounded by mountains. Because of this environment, even boys as young as 15 knew how to wield a sword. Swordsmanship was both a means of earning a living and a way for villagers to defend themselves against beasts. He recalled stories about monsters that had mutated from humans or animals, known as the evil Waisen. These tales were the reason everyone was taught swordsmanship early to survive. Someone had once told Rio that he could be hired as a knight if he tried, but he knew how rare such an opportunity was. Even in the capital, sword training officially began at 15, and those who wanted to survive had to start earlier rather than later. On the way, Rio met an older man who asked whether he was going to begin his training and wished him good luck. Rio responded that he assumed the training would start with physical exercises. The man laughed and remarked that Rio was very different from other children, adding that he hoped his own child would learn to be like him someday. Rio advised him not to set up terrace seating, pointing out that the clouds suggested strong winds and likely rain. He also mentioned that the air pressure could cause headaches, especially for his aunt. Just then, the aunt appeared, complaining of a headache and stating that she would not be able to work properly that day before leaving. The man expressed surprise and admitted that Rio had been right. Rio said that he should get going and asked the man to take good care of his wife. After Rio left, the man commented to his wife that Rio was very observant, and she agreed, saying that he was a good boy. Rio eventually arrived at the dojo, where several students had already gathered. The instructor remarked that it was good everyone had arrived on time. Rio felt surprised when he saw how many students were present. The master of the dojo was none other than Rakdoi. He stated that some of the students already knew him, and explained that, since there were new faces present, they would begin with a training run as a test. Rio quietly placed the gift he had brought for Rakdoi aside. Rakdoi then instructed everyone to run 20 laps around the perimeter of the street, while the newcomers were required to complete only 1 lap. He added that he would personally train the top 3 performers as much as he could. As Rio began running, he reflected that the perimeter was already demanding enough and that endurance was essential for everything. Physical fitness, he believed, was the foundation of all combat skills. While running, Rio noticed that many students were still on the track, but around 3 of them were missing. He reasoned that if 3 runners were ahead, the only thing he could do was push himself as fast as possible, hoping he might earn direct coaching. When he finally finished and returned, Rakdoi remarked that Rio was the first newcomer to complete the run. However, he added that it was unfortunate because Yudo and his friends had arrived before him. Rakdoi also commented that the senior students he had trained were faster than the rest. Rio felt uneasy, thinking that the 3 students mentioned were nearly 3 laps ahead, which seemed impossible. He reasoned that they could not have been that fast, since none of them had passed him during the run. He concluded that they must have been faking their lap count and felt confident about it. The 3 students appeared angered by this implication. Rakdoi responded that they had always been fast runners. Yudo added that they trusted the strength of their legs. Without directly addressing Rio, Yudo suggested that he must have made a mistake. Rio replied that it was only a possibility. Rakdoi agreed, stating that he could not be certain since he had not witnessed it himself. Afterward, they moved to the training ground, where Rakdoi announced that Rio would spar with Yudo. Rio agreed, and Yudo prepared as well. Rakdoi instructed both of them not to aim for the head. Rio thought that he did not know what he was supposed to say, but decided that observing his opponent came first. When the match began, Yudo rushed forward quickly and struck with his sword. As soon as he found an opening, he pointed the blade at Rio's neck. Rakdoi immediately stopped the match and praised Yudo for his execution. He then commented that some people merely followed instructions, while others could think and act for themselves, emphasizing the difference between the two. Rio wondered whether Rakdoi was implying that ignoring instructions was sometimes the correct approach. Rakdoi stated that those students were truly competent and skilled at what they did. He explained that they had learned through their own methods, and that approach had paid off. He further added that they had received a great deal of direct supervision, which inevitably helped them improve faster. Rio felt irritated as he reflected on this. He believed that while they might have learned the basics, self-practice alone was not enough. In an environment where people were allowed to be lazy while learning a skill, he felt there was no real difference between cleverness and true understanding. From Ryo's perspective, that was the reality he had observed there. It meant that students either continued repeating the basics or tried to outperform everyone around them to gain skills on their own. Either way, they remained stuck halfway between basic knowledge and proper technique. Ryo lacked confidence in such half-trained methods that relied only on basic forms and incomplete techniques. He wanted proper guidance because his life could one day depend on his swordsmanship. However, the real issue, as he saw it, was that those in higher positions did not care even when flaws were pointed out. He questioned where those students gained the confidence to risk their lives with swords when their training itself was flawed. Ryo realized that what he truly sought was guidance grounded in responsibility and fairness. With that thought, Ryo turned around, returned his sword, and bowed before Rakdoi. He stated that he would not be coming to the dojo again and thanked him for the instruction he had received. He added that he did not believe he could learn how to protect lives from someone who overlooked injustice. Rakdoi reacted in shock and began to say that if Ryo trained under him, he could guarantee his growth. However, Ryo interrupted him calmly, stating that he had already made his decision after careful thought and that the matter was settled. The following day, the scene shifted to the intersection near Bordeaux, where Ryo was working. A few men spoke to him, remarking that he must be Bard's son, and expressing surprise that he had returned home so early. Ryo replied that he saw no point in studying at such a place. At that moment, Ryo's father, Baldo, arrived and told the men not to spoil Ryo too much, adding that Ryo already knew how upset his mother had been the previous night. Ryo responded that it was Rakdoi who had advised him to think carefully about his decision. An argument then broke out between Ryo and his father. Ryo firmly stated that he was the one who knew how to defend himself and that he had gone there to learn how to protect others. He said he did not want to study at a place that lacked proper connections and questioned how he was supposed to save people under such circumstances. Baldo grew irritated and remarked that he had known Ryo would never back down. Ryo then replied that his stubbornness had been inherited from his father. This only angered Baldo further, and he scolded Ryo for running around aimlessly, telling him to focus on his work instead. He added that since everything had turned out this way, Ryo should at least do him a favor by delivering something for him. Hearing this, Ryo wondered what it was that his father wanted him to deliver. He then decided to move the cart, realizing that running alone was not enough, and that he lacked the strength to rely only on escape. He understood that he would need some form of offense. He thought about making a lightweight sword and planned to craft one using scrap wood from the barn once he returned home. Eventually, he reached his destination and rang Khalil's bell, calling out to ask if he was there. Ryo recalled that Khalil's father had been a former adventurer who had returned 6 months earlier and was a good friend of the guild. About 6 months ago, the place had been nothing more than a patch of weeds, but now it was completely cleaned and looked beautiful. He noticed that the gate was already open and found Khalil inside, completely drunk, asking what Ryo wanted. Ryo felt disgusted and thought that Khalil no longer resembled an ex-adventurer, but rather looked like a tramp. Khalil impatiently told him to get to the point, so Ryo showed him the tied cat and explained that it was sent by his father and that delivering it was his responsibility. Khalil went to check it, commenting that the bald man had tied the knot with all his strength. Ryo thought it was just a formality, especially since Khalil was a one-armed man. Khalil then asked Ryo to untie the knot. When Ryo helped and they finally loosened it, he was shocked to discover that it was the real Jueju, a wicked beast. Khalil claimed that it was merely a monkey, but Ryo believed it was not a normal one. It was about the same height as him, though its build was different. His father had mentioned it before, and Ryo now realized that it was a monster in the flesh. Khalil then added that the monkey was currently injured. Khalil asked Ryo why he had not gone to practice when he was supposed to be there. Ryo remained silent for a while. Khalil then laughed, remarking that Ryo had some big ideas and that what he had done was a very bold move. After that, Ryo prepared to leave. Khalil apologized for calling him a kid and asked for his name. Ryo stayed silent, so Khalil said that he would remember the name Ryo and that he seemed like a decent kid. Later, Ryo returned home and drew 5 circles on the ground. He stood in the center holding a wooden sword and began self-training, jumping from one circle to another. While practicing, he realized that his movements were too fast and unrefined, causing him to lose his breath quickly. He understood that he needed to figure out how to control it. Suddenly, Khalil arrived and interrupted his practice. Ryo wondered if Khalil had come to see his father, but Khalil explained that he had some work to do and was curious whether Ryo wanted to watch. Ryo replied that he was almost finished anyway. Khalil then commented on Ryo's fighting style, mentioning that he had seen many styles before. He also noticed a board that had been cut and asked if he could borrow it from Ryo. Rio wondered what Khalil truly was. In response, Khalil said that it was easy to imagine such things when comparing oneself to others. They then moved to sword practice. Rio realized that he could not fall behind again like he had with Yudo. He knew he had to make a move and give it his all. When he finally launched his first attack, he discovered that Khalil easily dodged by lowering his stance and commented that Rio was not bad. Encouraged, Rio attacked again, thinking that Khalil might be underestimating him. However, he began to doubt whether he was suited to being the aggressor and wondered what his next move should be. Rio realized that the key was to find an opponent's weak point and exploit it. He understood that he first needed to carefully observe his opponent's movements and think through them. Khalil then announced that he would strike first. As Khalil moved toward him, Rio tried to stay focused, reminding himself that Khalil had only one arm, which meant his right side should be more vulnerable. When Khalil attacked, Rio used his sword to block, thinking that fighting this way would increase his chances of winning. He spotted an opening and moved in to strike, but Khalil immediately understood his intention. Once again, the exchange ended in Khalil's victory. Khalil asked Rio whether he had really thought it would be an easy win. Rio reflected that he had been struggling ever since the second time he attempted that approach and wondered what he had even been thinking. He then admitted that it was thanks to Khalil that he had noticed the empty space beneath his feet. He added that if someone needed to run, they also had to protect their legs and adjust their stance properly. Rio continued trying to figure out how to defeat someone like Khalil, who was clearly stronger than him, but in the end, he lost again. Khalil asked whether that defeat felt bad. Rio denied it and explained that his sword was slightly too long. Khalil questioned why Rio thought that way. Rio replied that he had made the sword to match the one he had seen at the dojo and had used the same style against Yudo, but Yudo had been much harder to handle. Because of that, Rio admitted that he could not properly control the sword. Khalil then explained that it was like trying to hold overflowing water in one's hands. No matter how hard one tried, it would spill and soak their clothes. He said that this was something beyond Rio's current skill level and that it could hurt him someday. Khalil added that Rio did not even know the basics yet, so it would be better for him to find something simpler that he could handle easily. Khalil asked whether he was wrong, and then said that Rio was actually right about 80% of the time. He explained that it was true that the easier something was to handle, the better the results would be. He also mentioned that a low stance was usually meant to be used against animals. Rio looked at the drawing Khalil was making and was stunned by his unique way of illustrating things. Khalil clarified that using something beyond one's skill did not necessarily mean Rio would get hurt. Rio agreed, but asked about the remaining incorrect part. Khalil responded that he thought the same way and added that no knowledge was more valuable than real experience. Khalil then pointed out that Rio lacked proper muscle strength and dismissed any comeback from him as meaningless. Rio became irritated, while Khalil assumed that Rio was merely trying to pass the time. However, Khalil also acknowledged that Rio had sharp eyesight and a quick mind. Despite his small body, he felt that Rio was well-balanced overall, which sounded like an unexpected compliment. At that moment, Rio's father, Baldo, arrived. When he noticed Khalil, he asked whether something was wrong. Khalil denied it and said that he had only brought lunch, then brought up the matter of the beast. Rio sensed that something was off. Khalil then asked whether, aside from the monkey, they were sure that no other evil beasts had been sighted nearby. Baldo was shocked by the question and asked what Khalil was trying to imply. Khalil explained that there had been no sightings of vessels for some time and that he was simply making sure. He added that they would need to investigate and that Baldo would have to help so they could confirm the situation. He also pointed out that the monkey had an axe wound on its belly, which had been inflicted by Baldo. Rio turned to his father and asked about it. Khalil then continued, explaining that the abdominal wound was fresh and still wet with blood, while the wound on the back was deep but dry, which led him to conclude that it had been inflicted earlier. He also revealed that there was another mark on the beast besides the axe wound, suggesting that something else had struck it. Rio wondered whether it was possible that something other than a human from the mountains had caused those injuries. Khalil agreed and said that he too was curious to find out what that mysterious presence in the mountains might be. Khalil explained that based on the angle and depth of the wound, the attacker had to be either the same size as Rio or even bigger. Rio found this observation interesting and remarked that Khalil really understood such details well. Khalil responded bluntly, telling Rio to mind his own business and saying that once he gained enough experience, he would be able to notice such things too. Baldo then addressed Khalil, stating that it must have been an evil beast. Khalil replied that there was still one possibility left. He wondered whether the creature had been attacked by another animal or by a person. He then stated that, according to his assumption, another evil beast had clearly attacked it. Because of that, he said he would stay in the mountains for a while and make sure that no one went up there. Baldo felt troubled, as he had been planning to take some people from the dojo into the mountains. Khalil immediately told him to stop and added that if someone was only good at running, surviving would be the best they could hope for. Baldo understood the warning and decided to leave to speak with the village chief. Khalil agreed and continued drinking. Before Khalil could continue, Rio interrupted and asked about the drawing Khalil had made, wondering whether it could be used with magic. Khalil thought about it and replied that it could be possible. Rio then said that he believed magic was something they could not use properly unless they learned it, and he asked whether Khalil could use magic as well. Khalil agreed and explained that he used magic mainly to strengthen his body. He described it as forming a thin film over oneself and added that swordsmanship worked in a similar way. However, he then admitted that magic was not his specialty. Khalil mentioned that in a few days, a great magician would be arriving and would demonstrate magic to Rio. He added that since Rio was already smart, he should go and learn as much as he could. Rio agreed with him. A few days later, the scene shifted to the dojo, where a man stood in front of the students and announced that he had been asked by Roshizu to teach them the basics of magic and how to use it properly. He introduced himself as Ogun, a great magician. Ogun began his lecture by saying that the students might already be familiar with magic through pictures and books. He explained that both animals and humans possessed magical power, but unlike humans, animals could not normally control or use it. As Ogun spoke, Rio found himself thinking about Ogun's clothing and appearance, recalling Khalil's words that Ogun was a high-level wizard. Ogun continued, explaining that magic usually required chanting. He then demonstrated a simple example, emphasizing that magic must be used properly. However, he added that if someone possessed an object with a magic circle drawn on it, they could activate magic without chanting. To demonstrate, Ogun created a magic ball and warned the students to be cautious, explaining that there were exceptions among animals. He then asked if anyone knew what those exceptions were. One of the boys answered that they were evil beasts. Ogun agreed and explained that animals that turned into evil beasts were capable of using magic. He said that such creatures had harmed humans and possessed the ability to mutate. He also mentioned that one had recently been sighted in the area and that he had even heard it had come down from the mountains. Ogun added that he had rarely encountered such beasts himself, which was why he urged everyone to remain careful. He then continued the lecture, explaining that learning magic required rigorous training to strengthen the entire body. At that moment, Yudo stood up and asked a question. He said that he had heard that once someone learned attack magic, their body would strengthen quickly, and he asked Ogun to teach him that type of magic. Ogun immediately refused, saying that he understood how Yudo felt, but attack magic required a great deal of power. He explained that even a single mistake while chanting could seriously harm another person, which made such magic extremely dangerous. Because of that, he said he would not teach someone who was grinning and laughing while begging for a lesson, adding that he was not so senile as to do so. Ogun stated that he was willing to teach everyone, but there was a possibility that not everyone would be able to learn magic. Therefore, he had to be careful and make no mistakes in his teaching. Yudo apologized and sat back down. After that, Rio raised his hand and asked if he could ask a question. As he stood up, he mentioned that earlier, Ogun had said that evil beasts could use magic, so he wondered whether evil beasts were also able to chant. Ogun praised the question, saying it was a very good one. He then explained that evil beasts generally could not speak, but some individuals might be able to use special forms of magic. Rio then asked whether that meant such magic was not something ordinary humans could use and was limited to special cases. Ogun agreed with this interpretation. From that, Rio understood that they would need to plan carefully when fighting evil beasts. Ogun then added that they could check the books kept at the village chief's house for further details and said that it was fine if Rio wanted to do so. Rio agreed and thanked him. After that, Ogun told everyone to move on to the next step, which was practicing magic. He instructed them to follow his directions carefully and begin by strengthening their bodies. He then commanded them to place their dominant hand over their heart. A few days later, Rio was in the backyard of his house, attempting to use magic. He tried to feel and gather his magical power, directing it towards specific parts of his body that he wanted to strengthen. He was slowly getting used to magic, but the real problem was maintaining it for a long period. Since he did not possess a large amount of magical power, he had to use it carefully and wisely. Even so, he felt that magic was extremely convenient. Just then, Yudo arrived with his friends, saying that they had heard Rio was making a wooden sword for a game with Cadillac. They asked to see it, and after examining the sword, one of them remarked that it was beautifully made. Another commented that it resembled the kind of sword used in a dojo. Yudo then mocked Ryo, saying sarcastically that Ryo seemed more talented than him. Suddenly, Yudo dropped the sword and deliberately stepped on it, cracking it, while pretending that it had been an accident. He then threw the broken sword back at Ryo and remarked that it would now be easier to use it as firewood for the fireplace. At that, everyone burst into laughter. Yudo went on to boast that they were excellent and would be going mountain hiking, adding that someone stupid like Ryo and a loser like Khalil made a perfect pair. Ryo calmly replied that mountain hiking was currently regulated and asked whether they were really going alone. He reminded them that a few days earlier, after the incident involving the evil beast, people from the guild had come to the village following Khalil's case. As far as Ryo knew, the investigation had not yet been completed and the area was still under restriction. Yudo dismissed his concerns, stating that although the teacher had warned them not to go alone, they were strong enough to receive special permission. The others agreed with him and said that they were busy, which was why they were leaving. As they went ahead, Ryo was left wondering whether everything would truly be alright, especially since Rakdoi was not with them. While Ryo was thinking about all of this, his uncle arrived, looking unusually cheerful. Ryo wondered if something good had happened. His uncle told him that he had brought Ryo's share from the hunt and mentioned that they had caught many birds. Ryo thanked him, and when he took the bag, he was surprised by how heavy it was. As he checked the weight, Ryo thought that he currently needed more physical strength. He tried to channel magic into his hands, thinking that he needed to be able to use it unconsciously whenever required. His uncle was shocked to see that Ryo was actually able to perform physical enhancement. Ryo replied modestly that he was simply training every day. His uncle then revealed that only top-level students could usually use such abilities continuously and mentioned, with some emotion, how Yudo had been showing off earlier. Ryo found it easy to imagine that scene. He also mentioned that Jugin had said he had received permission to enter the mountains. In response, his uncle said that he had not heard anything about the regulations being lifted. However, he added that Rakdoi was going as well, and if that was the case, it should be fine for them to go together. Before leaving, his uncle asked Ryo to convey his greetings to his parents. Ryo agreed and thanked him for everything. After the uncle left, Khalil arrived, clearly drunk. Ryo remarked that there had been quite a lot of visitors that day. Khalil casually asked whether Ryo's sword practice and magic training were going well. Ryo agreed and explained that he had been thinking about extending the duration of his physical enhancement. Khalil reacted with surprise, commenting that it was not a bad goal. He then glanced at the items nearby and said that he would take some of them. Ryo asked why he needed them, to which Khalil bluntly replied that it was to save money for drinks. This response irritated Ryo, who was clearly fed up with Khalil's drinking habits. Khalil then revealed that he had a message from the village chief, saying that a research team from the Adventurers Guild would be arriving soon. He added that once their investigation was complete, Ryo would be allowed to enter the mountain, which was currently restricted. Ryo was surprised and asked whether the survey had still not been completed. Khalil struggled to steady himself and explained that the adventurers could not come immediately because they were busy. He added that hunting was only permitted for adults and that children were strictly forbidden from entering the area. At this, Ryo began to sweat. Noticing his reaction, Khalil asked whether Ryo was hiding something. After hesitating, Ryo admitted that Yudo and his friends had claimed they had received special permission and that the three of them had already headed toward the mountain. Khalil was shocked and angrily called the three of them idiots, stating that there was no such special permission and that the guild had not even begun its investigation yet. Khalil mentioned that Rakdoi had to accompany him, so he could not go that day, which left him extremely angry with the children. He thought about going after them and decided to first check inside the village. Ryo stated that he would call the chief and his father for support. He wondered what kind of signal Khalil would use if he managed to find them. Khalil replied that he would ring the alarm as soon as he found them and leave the rest to the adults. Ryo agreed, but warned him not to get drunk and fall down or crash into a tree. Khalil responded that he would remember that when he returned. After some time, at the village entrance, the chief mentioned that he and Ryo had searched the entire village, but Yudo and the others were nowhere to be found. Baldo stated that he and several others would search the mountains as a separate team from Khalil and the rest. He added that if they ran into trouble or security became an issue, they should fire a smoke signal so help could reach them immediately. He further stated that Ryo and the chief would remain in the village. Ryo then said that if the IFR was issued and the others returned, he would be the one to give the smoke signal. After that, everyone departed. Later, Ryo called the chief and asked about Rakdoi. The chief replied that there was a weapon shop on the way to town and that they had gone there to buy armor. Ryo looked up at the sky and thought that the heavy rainfall would make things worse. It would be difficult both to search and to send smoke signals. However, he believed that if they found the children before the weather worsened, everything would be fine. As they were standing there, the adventurer party they had requested finally arrived. The leader introduced himself as Furao and said that he had already heard about the situation. He added that he was relieved they were nearby. The village chief stepped forward for a handshake and requested that they subdue the evil beast. Furao agreed, stating that his party would do their best. However, he also mentioned that he was not accustomed to working in heavy rain, and since they were unfamiliar with the area, having a guide would make things easier. The chief gave it some thought. Ryo observed the party carefully and assumed that 2 of them were strong swordsmen. He guessed that the girl was a magician, while the slender man could be either a swordsman or a mage. Although the decision had been made in haste, the party appeared reliable. Ryo knew that most of the adults were already searching, so he wondered who could guide them. Suddenly, Ryo sensed something strange coming from the forest and rushed toward it. The chief was startled and asked what had happened. Ryo replied that he had seen a limping figure in the forest and suspected the person was injured. He added that, as far as he could tell, there were no pursuers nearby. Ryo soon found an injured man, whom he recognized as an uncle from the village, and asked if he was all right. Furao also questioned what had happened. The injured man explained that an evil spirit had appeared, Itachi's evil beast, and that Yudo and the others were still at the swamp. The girl in the party told him not to speak and said she would treat his injuries first. Furao stated that there was no time to waste and that they needed to hurry. He spoke to the village chief, asking him to take the injured man to a safe place while they went ahead to subjugate the beast. When the chief hesitated, worried about the lack of a guide, Ryo decided that he would go with them. The chief was shocked, knowing how dangerous it would be. Ryo explained that he could strengthen his body and would not recklessly interfere with Furao and the others. He added that if he became a hindrance, he would hide instead. With no other options left, the chief still hesitated, but Furao reassured him, promising that he would protect Ryo. He also remarked that Ryo seemed to be a very smart child. The girl then joined in, saying that she had finished the treatment and would stay by Ryo's side as well. Furao greeted Ryo, and with that, the group moved toward the forest. They went near the lake and found that no one was there. Along the way, they noticed several sticks stabbed into the ground and even embedded in the trees. Someone pointed out that there were strange scars, suggesting that a fight might have taken place. They also spotted a cave ahead. Furao stated that he would take the lead and suggested that they split up. The girl mentioned that since the adults searching for the children were armed, she would go in a different direction. Furao agreed and said that he would leave that side to Mirren. Mirren accepted, told them to be careful, and then left. Furao believed it would be fine to leave Mirren on his own, as he was both a skilled swordsman and a capable magician. Furao then told the rest to continue forward. Another man in the party advised Furao to behave properly around Ryo. As they moved on, Furao asked Ryo whether his father knew that reinforcements were coming. Ryo replied that they had been informed that adventurers would arrive to investigate. He added that, judging by the condition of the mountain, many preparations had already been made and that people were not allowed to enter the mountain freely, which was how he had guessed the situation. He also mentioned that there were many evil beasts in the area and that he had been present when this was discovered. The other man was surprised and remarked that Ryo did not sound like a child at all and seemed unusually calm. Ryo replied that it was because his mind was occupied with other thoughts, which they found interesting. Suddenly, Ryo sensed something and warned Furao. Furao, who was walking ahead, said that it seemed something was hiding inside the cave. The other man stated that he would handle it and suggested that the rest move in to join him. Ryo thought that the beast seemed smaller than he had expected. Furao moved to shield Ryo. Soon, they came face to face with a cat-like beast, and Furao said that they would deal with it. Suddenly, the beast caused numerous tree branches to appear. Furao wondered if it was using a long-range attack and found it surprising given its small body. Ryo realized that it was the evil beast using magic and noted that fortunately, it had not noticed him yet. Moments later, the beast launched its magic attack, sending the small branches flying toward them. Ryo remembered their earlier discussion, in which Furao had stated that other people were hiding inside the cave. According to the plan, the adventurers would distract the beast, and once Furao gave the signal, Ryo was supposed to enter the cave and join the others. Ryo stopped thinking about the plan for a moment, believing that he could rush in at any time. He also wanted to watch Furao's battle, as it was a rare chance to witness the fight of a powerful swordsman breaking apart the incoming branches with his blade. Soon, Furao gave the signal, and Ryo immediately rushed toward the cave, thinking that he still had much to learn from Furao. He jumped inside and called out to his father and the others, asking if they were safe. Baldo was surprised to see him there and asked why he had come. Ryo explained that the adventurer party had arrived earlier than expected and that he had accompanied them as a guide. He added that they were currently fighting the beast outside. Baldo agreed and suggested that they join them quickly. As Ryo moved forward, he noticed the female adventurer standing nearby. She used her power to create a barrier-type magic and instructed everyone to stay back, saying that they would deal with the evil beast first. Ryo hesitated, but the woman did not listen to his concerns. Outside the cave, Furao grew furious and declared that the beast did not have the right to turn away. He then announced that it was time to end the fight and delivered a powerful slash at the creature. After the battle ended, the villagers came out of the cave as well. Furao stated that although they lacked concrete proof, they had fulfilled the request and defeated the beast. Baldo Dani stated that they could not leave until the next day because of the weather and the late hour, and that they still had to find the missing children. Furao agreed, saying that his party would escort the villagers. Ryo thought about the evil beast they had encountered earlier. At first, it had appeared to be a normal weasel, but later, it had changed its form. Realizing that such creatures existed, Ryo concluded that he needed to train harder and strengthen his body even more. As he reflected on everything that had happened, Furao called out to him and asked whether the children they were searching for were as strong or as calm as he was. Baldo replied that, unlike Ryo, all of them trained at the dojo, so they were not weak. One of the adventurers added that anyone who dared to enter the restricted mountain must be quite capable. Ryo made an awkward expression at that comment. Seeing this, Furao laughed, patted him on the head, and told him not to make such a face. He added that Ryo was good at understanding situations and turning things to their advantage, and that if they knew what was going on, they could move safely around the area. Finally, Furao said that they should focus on finding the children quickly and then return home safely. After that, they all started moving forward. Ryo felt that the situation was getting worse the deeper they went, as it was becoming increasingly difficult to use physical enhancement. Even though he was focusing only on what mattered, Furao remarked that the thunder was troubling, and that it was unfortunate they still had investigations left to complete. Ryo wondered whether the subjugation was not already finished. In response, Furao explained that the changes in the land and the subjugation of the beast were connected. He added that it was frightening because the entire area could be destroyed, and his responsibility was to investigate everything thoroughly and submit a report. Ryo thought about it and decided that if he ever encountered the evil beast alone, he would immediately run away without hesitation. Another man assured him that he only needed to stay in the village and should not worry, as he would handle everything himself. They intended to speak with Khalil, who knew a great deal about the area, but Khalil had not changed and was still rushing around just as he had been for a long time. Ryo wondered whether that man was an acquaintance of Khalil. Suddenly, someone mentioned that the rain made the ground smell strongly of dirt. Ryo looked down and noticed something strange. He thought that the loud thunder and the swaying trees were creating a constant rumbling sound, and he was not accustomed to the unusual earthy smell. He noticed broken tree branches and scattered pebbles that seemed to have been carried along. He wondered if they were in a valley. He called out to his father and said that the place used to be a river. Everyone was surprised to hear this. Just then, they heard a noise and saw a huge stone rolling down toward them. Everyone quickly moved aside, but Ryo realized that even if he ran, he would not escape in time. He decided to strengthen his body to the maximum instead. Somehow, he managed to dodge the attack by jumping. When the others called out to him, he replied that he was completely fine. His father then warned that it was a boulder, which meant that a muddy stream was likely coming. Ryo acknowledged this and said he would move immediately. However, when he tried to strengthen his body again, his legs failed him and he collapsed. No matter how hard he tried, he could not stand up. Suddenly, a heavy stream of water rushed in right beside Ryo. Ryo was dragged away by the muddy stream right before everyone's eyes. He was unable to do anything as the pressure of the water was extremely strong, and he feared that he might even die if it continued. Suddenly, he noticed something nearby and tightened his grip around it, thinking that he had to strengthen his body, even if only slightly, to protect himself. With great effort, he managed to pull himself out of the stream. He felt relieved that he had survived, but his body was in immense pain. Having been swept far downstream, he realized that he was now quite a distance away from the others. He wondered whether he could even move in his current condition, and assumed that rescue would take several days to arrive. He understood that he needed to bandage his injuries as soon as possible, especially since there was a chance that beasts might be drawn to the smell of his blood. He also thought that if his father had been there, he would have scolded him severely. Now, however, he had no choice but to rely on himself, and he decided that his first priority was to find food. Fortunately, he came across the corpse of a deer that had been pierced by a broken wooden branch. He marked the area as a landmark and then moved forward cautiously, aware that there were sharp, broken rocks hidden in the sediment. He wished he could wash the blood off himself in the nearby stream. After that, he sat down to rest, and after some time, the rain finally stopped, allowing visibility to improve slightly. He recalled Pharaoh's explanation that the evil beast used long-distance magic and that there were many different types of such creatures. He kept this in mind so that he could react quickly if needed, though he remembered that the weasel-like creature had been guarding something earlier. When he examined the marks he had made, he realized that the wound on the evil creature looked as though it had been caused by a sharp object, roughly the size of a human attack. This meant that an evil beast was still roaming the mountains, and if that was true, he needed to be far more cautious. Suddenly, he sensed something in front of him. As he listened carefully, he realized the sound likely belonged to a beast, which would be especially dangerous if it was a carnivore. In his current condition, he knew he would be the perfect prey. He tried to calm himself and think clearly, but the sounds continued, and he realized that his movements had probably already been noticed. He was certain that he would lose, yet even with his injured leg, he resolved to give his full effort and make the first move. However, when he turned to attack, he was shocked to find a woman standing there without any clothes. He was stunned that someone like her could be in such a place. As he took in her condition, he quickly closed his eyes, wondering why she was not wearing any clothes at all, and whether she could not feel even a little embarrassed. He then thought that regardless of her appearance, she was still just a girl who carried no weapon. He did not feel any hostility from her, though he found it strange that her feet were the only part of her body covered in dirt. He asked for her name and questioned what she was doing there, but she simply turned her face away and ignored him. Seeing this, Rio felt deeply uncomfortable and at a loss for what to do next. Rio then noticed something lying beside him and threw his overcoat toward the girl, telling her to wear it. He even tried to explain, as best as he could, how she should put it on. After some effort, the girl managed to wear the coat. Even then, Rio sensed no sign of hostility from her. He realized that she had likely never lived in the mountains, and he had never heard of a woman as beautiful as her from any nearby village. Although there was a possibility that she had been kidnapped, leaving her alone was not an option for him. He asked her whether she knew of any places nearby where they could hide and whether it would be safer to move there. Before she could respond, he heard her stomach growl, which made him decide that they should eat something first. He cooked some food, and after eating, he felt slightly relieved. However, he noticed that the meat smelled strongly of iron and tasted unpleasant, as he had not properly drained the blood. The girl behaved like a small child, moving toward things without any awareness. For reasons he could not fully explain, Rio realized that she was not speaking at all. Her reactions made it seem as though she was experiencing everything for the first time. She showed no hesitation, even reaching toward the fire, along with many other dangerous actions. This strange behavior made it impossible for Rio to take his eyes off her. Since she did not speak or make any sounds, he wondered whether she was even able to understand him. He gently told her to chew her food properly and not swallow everything at once. He knew that if he burned raw wood, thick smoke would rise and act as a signal. Since it was early morning, he was confident that someone would notice it. Still, he worried about the girl, which made it difficult for him to move or ensure their safety while waiting to be found. He suddenly felt as though something was watching him and looked at the girl, asking her what she wanted. At that moment, he heard a low growl from above. He pushed the girl aside just as a wild cat leaped at him. Somehow, Rio managed to force it back and realized that the creature was fast and had noticed his injured leg, marking him as weak prey. When he saw that the girl was still sitting there, he wondered whether she had any awareness of the danger. The wild cat attacked again, and Rio felt despair at what might happen next. After some time, he heard Khalil's voice telling him to open his eyes. Khalil had already slain the wild cat and asked whether Rio was all right. Rio thanked him sincerely. Khalil then called Pharaoh over, joking that Rio had been flirting with a girl. Shocked, Rio immediately denied it. Pharaoh examined Rio's leg and questioned whether he could even walk in that condition. Rio then asked how they had found him. Khalil explained that it was because of the smoke signal. Rio wondered whether they had followed the smoke alone, but Pharaoh clarified that his sister could use magic and that 3 others had been searching continuously. They eventually spotted the smoke coming from Rio's location. When Rio asked about Yudo and the others, Pharaoh replied that everyone else was safe and unharmed. He added that Mirren had been the first to notice the smoke using a bardo, while he himself had been coming down the mountain at the time. Khalil agreed, and then mentioned that Pharaoh's panicked reaction upon hearing that Rio had been swept away had been quite something. Furao teased Khalil about it, which only annoyed him, prompting Khalil to complain that Furao talked far too much. Khalil then asked Rio about the girl. Rio explained that he himself did not understand her situation either, as she had been in a strange condition when he found her and was unable to speak, behaving more like a small child. Furao speculated that she might be a newly born divine spirit related to the evil spirit. However, he added that he should not share such assumptions without confirmation, and that he would explain more once he knew the truth. He was certain that Rio would feel worried, but he emphasized that patience was necessary. Rio agreed with him. Furao then continued by saying that when he had left the Adventurer Guild, he had not heard any reports about a missing person. Considering the many unknown factors involved, he believed it would be better to investigate everything together, instead of jumping to conclusions. Khalil added that once they reached the town, the child would be properly taken care of. Rio then asked what had happened to the corpse of the evil beast weasel. Furao replied that its body had been collected separately. They exchanged a brief glance, after which Furao added that he also found the situation suspicious. Rio responded that he did not particularly care about it. Khalil then stated that Vasil was responsible for the monkey's death and believed that there was probably at least one more culprit involved. Soon after, another adventurer approached them and thanked them for waiting, informing them that everyone was ready to depart. After everyone was told to get moving, one man lifted Rio onto his back, while another carried the girl as they headed back. As they moved, Rio noticed that, as expected of an active adventurer, the man carrying him was not even out of breath despite running with him on his back. Rio then asked Furao whether he had known Khalil before. Furao explained that Khalil was only a C-rank adventurer, but had once been a party member. Despite his rank, Khalil was capable of keeping up with wild animals and ordinary evil beasts. He added that Baldo was also a C-rank adventurer. Rio was surprised to learn that both of them were so strong. Furao continued by saying that Khalil had been dissatisfied with his rank, which was why he had gone to the dojo and trained relentlessly. With his skills and effort, he could have settled down properly, but instead, he had fallen into constant drinking. Furao thought things had improved after Khalil became attached to the village, but in the end, he was still the same as ever. Rio wondered whether Furao had been shocked by that. Furao replied that he had been a little surprised, but after seeing what had happened, he felt relieved. He mentioned that Khalil had been the first to jump into action, which proved that his core nature had not changed. Khalil did not find those words amusing and shouted at them, complaining that they were being too noisy and distracting him. Furao commented that Khalil was, as always, trying to hide his embarrassment. Eventually, they reached the village entrance, where Rio reunited with his father. At that moment, the girl suddenly grabbed onto Rio's clothes. Worried, Rio brought her back to his house. His mother was confused and jokingly wondered whether her son had split in two and turned one half into a daughter. Hesitantly, Rio explained everything to her. A few days later, thanks to proper treatment, Rio's leg injury began to heal, and he was able to go about his daily life without much trouble. Yudo and the others offered explanations, saying they had only meant to thank Ragdoy. Rio had nothing to say, as they had already been scolded by their parents. Ragdoy bowed his head over his disciple's mistake, though he was not held responsible since he had been unable to stop them. After discussions, the mountain entry regulations were reinstated. Meanwhile, Furao, Khalil, and the others began investigating various evil beasts. Rio sincerely hoped the situation would be resolved quickly. The girl was given the name Shiraa, and Rio continued to keep her at his home. He asked her to follow him, and over time, she was somehow trained to respond to him. Rio believed the reason she had grown attached to him was that she felt completely at ease around him. However, he desperately wanted to stop her from entering the bath without clothes. Still, he was gradually getting used to it, thinking of Shiraa as a child and believing that it could not be helped. Later, Mirren came to visit and asked Rio and Shiraa about Rio's leg injury. Fudo and the others stood behind Mirren and did not seem pleased to see Rio. Rio explained that his injury was healing well. Mirren then remarked that Shiraa also seemed to be doing well. Rio wondered how Mirren knew that and recalled that Mirren was skilled in both swordsmanship and magic. Mirren explained that he had been teaching swordsmanship to Fudo and the others and offered to teach Rio as well if he was interested. However, Fudo interrupted, saying it would be better to leave the village's most cowardly person alone. Rio apologized to Mirren, saying he had other matters to attend to, and excused himself. Mirren was left feeling that Rio was a mysterious child. Rio then went to deliver a lunchbox to his father. His father exclaimed that Shiraa had come along as well. One man commented that seeing Rio together with Shiraa made him look like an older brother. Others laughed at the remark. Finally, Khalil, Furao, and Baldo returned, and Baldo asked how the situation was going. Khalil replied that things were not going well. He then turned to Rio and asked whether he remembered anything about Shiraa. Rio denied knowing anything, and Furao agreed with him. Khalil warned them that if anything happened, they should inform him immediately, as he had a bad feeling about the mountain. However, despite his unease, they still had no clear idea of what was truly happening there. 2 months had passed since the incident involving the evil beast. Although the weasel beast had been successfully subjugated, the wounds discovered on the monkey beast revealed the presence of other evil beasts in the mountains. As a result, the investigation was extended, and strict restrictions were imposed on entering the mountain. The wounds had yet to be fully resolved, and without Rio realizing it, summer passed and autumn drew near. Rio was spending his days practicing swordsmanship, applying the knowledge he had learned so far. On that particular day, he finally finished his training session and stood drenched in sweat. Shiraa handed him a towel, which he accepted with gratitude. He reflected that it was unfortunate they were unable to enter the mountains during autumn, as it was usually the most bountiful season. Even the adults in the village seemed concerned about the situation. Rio wondered whether the village's current stockpile would be enough to last through the winter. As he thought about it, a blister on his hand burst open, and blood began to seep out again. He felt that he had not pushed himself hard enough. In addition to sword practice, he continued his daily routine of running and muscle training while carrying extra weight. He believed he had gained some muscle and quietly wished he had inherited a strong physique like his father's, though he did not desire an overly heavy body. Shiraa noticed his injury and went to check his hand, but Rio told her that it was nothing serious. While she gently examined it, Khalil arrived with a group of adventurers and jokingly remarked that Rio seemed to be flirting as usual. Rio immediately pulled his hand back and insisted that it was not like that. He then referred to Khalil as a drunk uncle, which irritated Khalil, especially since Rio had been calling him that frequently lately. Rio then asked Furao whether he had any business with his team. Furao explained that he had only come to greet them and that he planned to leave the village the following day. He intended to return to the guild to report the current situation and mentioned that he would likely come back during winter to check on Rio. He added that they had simply stopped by to say hello and had picked Khalil up on their way back. Khalil suddenly struck Furao, causing him considerable pain. He claimed that he had merely been observing Rio and had no other intentions. During the conversation, Rio asked Furao if he had some time to spare. When Furao asked if something was wrong, Rio admitted that he had not yet mastered swordsmanship and wondered if Furao could give him one more lesson before leaving the village. Furao agreed and proceeded to train him, striking Rio repeatedly to force him to lose balance and improve his stance. After the training session ended and the two were resting, Furao noticed that Rio was sorting fumago fruits. When he asked whether they were being stored for winter, Rio explained that the entire village had been forbidden from entering the mountains. Because of that restriction, everyone was being urged to conserve resources and make only the minimum necessary efforts. Rio explained that even gathering supplies near the foot of the hill was no longer sufficient. He mentioned that although there were fruits similar to frog fruit in the area, they were poisonous, which made the situation even more concerning. Furao remarked that Mirren had mentioned it was possible to eat frog fruit if it was processed properly. At that point, Khalil announced that he was leaving, saying that he had just remembered something he needed to discuss with Mirren and was heading to see him. Furao agreed and suggested that they meet again later. Before leaving, Khalil briefly spoke to Furao about compensation related to the investigation, mentioning that Mirren would be staying in the village during the winter and that there would be meetings regarding the matter. From their conversation, Rio understood that Mirren would remain behind in the village. Furao explained that Mirren was skilled in both magic and swordsmanship and would continue helping Rio improve. Rio thought it was a good thing, noting that Mirren was always smiling, though he found it difficult to understand his true feelings, as Mirren was a rather strange person. Furao then stated that it was time for them to leave. As he departed, he advised Rio to train until he could swing his sword without developing blisters. Rio agreed with that advice. The next day, Furao and the others left the village. About a month passed with little visible progress. During his practice, Rio began swinging his sword more gently. Though he felt the strikes were less powerful, they were noticeably faster, and he could recover his stance quickly even while using only one hand. Shiraa, who was sitting nearby, noticed the difference and asked why his movements were unusual. Rio wondered why she pointed it out, and she replied that he normally used both hands, but now he was practicing with one, asking whether she should pretend not to notice. Rio relaxed beside her and told her it was fine, admitting that he was still inexperienced, but was glad she had noticed the change. He then remarked that the weather was getting colder and asked her to make sure she wore her jacket. She thanked him softly. Rio gently patted her head, thinking that she really was like a small, cute child. He remembered that she had always had an excellent memory and was especially good at reading and writing. Everyone in the village cared for her and treated her like a child. Yet, despite all that, Ryo realized that he still did not know anything about her origins. Just then, his father approached and instructed both of them to get back to the tasks he had assigned. They were assigned the task of delivering blankets and food to households in need. Their first stop was Khalil's house, where he accepted the supplies while expressing his appreciation. He mentioned that after this, they should also visit Mirren's place. Ryo agreed, though he could not help asking about the earlier discussion regarding rewards and compensation. Khalil wondered whether Ryo had heard about it from Furao. He then explained that, due to a mistake, Mirren had not been properly registered in the guild's records. Anticipating what Ryo was about to say, Khalil told him not to make such an unpleasant expression. He handed Ryo a letter addressed to Furao, saying that he hoped it would help resolve the issue. Khalil then asked whether Ryo was continuing his training properly. Ryo replied that he practiced every day and added that Khalil had not appeared recently, wondering if something had happened. Khalil dismissed the concern, claiming that the weather was getting colder and that his old wounds were aching. Ryo immediately called it a lie, pointing out that Khalil had a habit of touching his chin with his thumb whenever he felt uncomfortable, even if he did not notice it himself. Khalil tried to steer the conversation away, saying that this was not what they were supposed to be discussing. He thought to himself that dealing with someone like Ryo was truly exhausting. Soon after, he abruptly sent both Ryo and Shiraa out, stating that he was in the middle of something important and did not want to be disturbed. Ryo was shocked by the sudden dismissal, and Khalil added casually that Ryo should pass along his greetings to his mother. After they left, Khalil remained seated, muttering to himself that it was really difficult to watch everything unfold. That evening, Ryo and Shiraa visited Mirren's house. Mirren greeted them warmly and invited them inside. Ryo excused himself briefly, asking whether it would be all right to place the blankets on the bed. Mirren replied that the cold had been worsening lately and thanked him for the consideration. Ryo felt that the atmosphere in the house was especially comfortable. Mirren then mentioned that he wanted to discuss something with Ryo and asked whether he had time. Ryo agreed, and they sat down together while Mirren served tea. Mirren warned that the topic might be somewhat unpleasant for Ryo and explained that, aside from Rakdoi's dojo, he also taught swordsmanship to Yudo and several others. He then explained his request plainly. He wanted Ryo to formally declare a sparring match and fight Yudo with swords, and win. Ryo was stunned by the suggestion. Mirren went on to explain that while teaching Yudo, he had noticed personality issues rooted in Yudo's family circumstances. Yudo believed himself to be strong and constantly sought to prove it, which had driven him to recklessly enter the mountains. Ryo interrupted, clearly shocked, and asked why Mirren had chosen him, pointing out that he had only sparred with Yudo once. Mirren replied that he was grateful for Ryo's perceptiveness. He explained that Yudo had once lost to Mirren, rebelled against him afterward, and had since come to look down on Ryo as well. Ryo felt there was little benefit for him in this arrangement. However, Mirren pointed out that Ryo was developing his own swordsmanship and asked whether he would not want to test how far he had come. Ryo hesitated as Mirren continued, adding that he had no fixed timeline in mind and would simply continue training Yudo until the time came, provided Ryo did not mind. In the end, Ryo remarked that Mirren was exceptionally good at motivating people. He then resolved that he would accept the challenge, fight properly, and refuse to lose. Mirren asked Ryo to keep their discussion strictly between the two of them, saying that it was all he had wanted to talk about. Ryo agreed. He then stood up and called out to Shiraa, telling her that it was time for them to head home. He noticed that she was still looking around at the items inside the house. Mirren remarked that everything there was part of his treasure. He explained that while what was on display was only a fraction of it, each item held memories from his travels. He spoke about a horsewhip that had been given to him by a knight from a distant country, someone who had treated him kindly and whom he had once called a friend, though that knight had eventually gone missing. He then spoke about other items, including clothes and seashells, telling Ryo that all of them were precious memories and personal treasures. Ryo wondered quietly whether it was merely a coincidence that so many people connected to Mirren had either disappeared or died. Shiraa asked in surprise whether that was truly the case. In response, Mirren showed them something inside his locket, explaining that it was different from the others and that he used it to distinguish between friend and foe. He added that it too would one day become a memory. Suddenly, Ryo felt an unsettling sensation. Without explaining, he grabbed Shiraa's hand and thanked Mirren for having them over before quickly leaving. Mirren agreed and told them to be sure to visit again. After walking some distance away, Ryo stopped to calm himself, still troubled by the strange feeling. He wondered what Mirren might be hiding behind his eyes. Although he did not want to think poorly of him, Ryo considered the possibility that everything displayed on the shelves might simply be relics of the past. He reminded himself that Mirren was an adventurer, so it was natural for him to possess mementos of lost companions. Ryo also realized that the same fate might someday await him as well. Shiraa suddenly held his hand and asked if he was all right, noting that his hands were cold and trembling. She urged him to hurry home if he was feeling unwell. Ryo steadied himself and agreed, telling her they should head back. Just then, they heard a low growl ahead. Ryo immediately told Shiraa to step back and prepare to run. He asked her to break a branch from a nearby tree and throw it to him. She agreed without hesitation. Ryo soon came face to face with a beast. He realized it was extremely thin, likely having come down from the mountain in search of food. It did not appear to be an evil beast and seemed to be acting alone, but Ryo knew that an enraged beast was often the most dangerous. Whether they were ready or not, it was going to attack. The beast suddenly lunged forward, but Ryo leaped aside to avoid it. He thought that even if he could not defeat it, he at least needed to drive it away. Shiraa shouted and threw the branch toward him. Ryo caught it and activated his physical enhancement, focusing on reinforcing his body so he would not be overwhelmed. The wild dog had the advantage in speed, but even with such an unreliable weapon, Ryo prepared to counter. As the beast attacked again, he shoved the branch into its mouth and struck it, silently apologizing if it caused pain. He then hit its nose, believing that this might be his only chance. The dog immediately fled after the blow. Ryo felt a wave of danger pass, though his hand had been slightly injured in the struggle. Shiraa rushed over and asked if he was all right. Ryo assured her that he was fine and suggested that they head home at once. When they finally reached home, Ryo's mother greeted them and mentioned that they had a guest. Ryo wondered who it might be. As he entered the house, he saw his father sitting together with the village chief. His father explained that the chief had something important to discuss and asked Ryo to sit down. The village chief greeted Ryo warmly and suggested that they talk for a while. Ryo took a seat, still uncertain about what was happening. The chief remarked that it could be called a discussion and then stated his request directly. He wanted Ryo to participate in a sparring match against Yudo during the spring festival. Ryo paused to consider the proposal and wondered whether Mirren had known about this in advance. He then asked the chief for more details. The chief apologized briefly and proceeded to explain everything in full. Meanwhile, outside the house, someone clad in an overcoat was flying through the sky. The figure spoke quietly to himself, declaring that the time for fun and games had begun. His gaze was fixed on a single target, Ryo. Khalil learned that Ryo would be participating in the Spring Festival mock battle. Baldo explained that Yudo had nominated Ryo for the match, while Khalil remarked that Yudo was merely provoking him at that point. Baldo added that Ryo understood this as well. From the village chief's perspective, Baldo noted that if Yudo won, it would demonstrate how much the students had grown. On the other hand, if Ryo won, he would earn the right to fight Yudo and prove a point to those who were dissatisfied with him. Khalil wondered aloud what would happen if Ryo lost. Baldo replied that the outcome would depend on Ryo himself, but if Ryo gave up after the first defeat, Baldo would personally teach him everything again and place him back in the dojo class. Khalil commented that Baldo could be quite meat-headed at times. He clarified that this was simply his opinion as Ryo's parent, stating that instead of giving up, they would talk to Ryo properly so that he could absorb the experience and learn from it. Khalil was then reminded of his own past, recalling an incident from when he was around 10 years old. His parents had abandoned him and left the village, and when no one wanted to acknowledge him, he decided to make a name for himself so that people would have no choice but to notice him. By the age of 20, he had swung his sword relentlessly, eventually becoming a knight in service to his lord and carving his name into the records. Before that, he had lived as an adventurer, determined to leave his mark. Even when he hit the limits of his talent, he never stopped swinging his sword. Finally, at the age of 30, when he was left with nothing but misery, Khalil suddenly woke up from the dream, drenched in sweat, realizing that he had seen the same dream again. He blamed it on drinking too much alcohol. His hand throbbed with pain. One day, Saad resumed practicing his sword swings, as his hand was no longer injured. He felt that his upper body movements were currently very solid, but he also realized that certain parts of his body would not move properly unless he consciously focused on them, similar to his encounters with bobcats and wild dogs. The main issue, he realized, lay with his legs. He thought that if he were caught off guard, his legs would become extremely vulnerable. At that moment, Khalil suddenly arrived and called Ryo "little brat." Rio remarked that it had been a while since they had met and asked Khalil what he was doing there. Khalil replied that he was merely killing time and then went to sit beside Shiraa. Rio asked whether Khalil had heard about the Spring Festival mock battle. Khalil confirmed it, stating that Rio had been nominated by Yudo and that Khalil himself would get the chance to fight that bastard. Rio simply agreed with him. After that, Rio changed the topic and asked how important footwork was in a fight. Khalil explained that footwork was extremely important, as the feet formed the foundation of all human movement and were among the most crucial parts of the body. He added that even adventurers relied heavily on footwork, regardless of their swordsmanship. Rio acknowledged this and began drawing circles with his wooden sword, thinking that he needed to put more effort into training his legs during regular practice. Khalil then asked whether Rio had realized that he lacked talent with the sword. Rio continued making slow circles and agreed with Khalil's words, admitting that he knew his strength was insufficient and that his body had not yet been properly strengthened. Khalil was surprised that Rio was already aware of the wall he faced and was genuinely willing to make an honest effort to overcome it. Rio, however, felt that Khalil was being overly blunt. Khalil then stood up, picked up a stick, and told Rio to prepare himself, stating that as a senior, he would teach his junior a lesson. He added that if Rio kept talking less and still could not defeat him, then Rio would be forced to face the harsh reality that he did not possess what it took to master swordsmanship. Rio grew annoyed and asked Khalil to stop talking and to stop venting his frustrations on him. In response, Khalil suddenly rushed forward to attack, remarking that Rio should learn to accept the kindness of others. Rio immediately realized that he would be thrown aside if he took the hit head-on, so he jumped back to dodge, thinking that he needed to break Khalil's momentum. He then tried to counterattack when he saw an opening, but Khalil blocked it effortlessly and remarked that he was not telling Rio to give up swinging the sword. Rio was shocked by Khalil's defense and asked what Khalil was even trying to say. Khalil replied that if Rio lacked talent, then he should look at those who possessed it. He warned that relying only on the sword would eventually lead to loss and misery. He further cautioned Rio not to end up like himself, someone who returned with no talent, only injuries, and nearly died before realizing that it had all been a waste of time. Rio was confused by Khalil's words and felt that Khalil was speaking strangely, concluding that it was impossible to reason with someone stuck in their own bitterness. He noticed a sharp, unpleasant look in Khalil's eyes and stayed on guard as Khalil lowered his stance, clearly preparing to attack again. Rio realized that his only option was to observe carefully and respond to the incoming strike. Khalil charged forward once more, stating that he had no other choice and would now use all of his strength. As Khalil attacked, Rio thought that if it had not been for his water-based strength, he would have been blown away by that strike. From Khalil's perspective, he reflected that what he had said earlier might have been both correct and pointless. He also found it ridiculous that Rio was not attending the dojo and was instead forging a sword from scratch. However, he acknowledged that the decision ultimately belonged to Rio, and no matter how many times Rio lost, he was clearly not someone who would give up. Finally, Khalil slashed downward, forcing Rio's sword away, and pointed the stick at Rio's face. He told him that he should understand, though it seemed that Rio did not even want to. When Rio argued back that he had no intention of understanding, Khalil wondered why Rio was being so stubborn. He stated that Rio had no talent for the sword and was only as strong as Khalil himself. Even with body strengthening, Khalil believed it would be impossible for Rio to make a name for himself through swordsmanship. Rio agreed with everything he said. Khalil then warned him that if he truly understood his limits, he should question why he refused to give up. Rio pushed Khalil's stick aside and stated that Khalil was the one who had given up. He added that no one understood better than him that he was powerless and lacked talent with the sword. Khalil questioned why Rio refused to give up even though he was fully aware of that fact. Rio explained that it was not because he wanted to become a master swordsman or make a name for himself. In the beginning, he admitted, he had been rebelling against the dojos and their teachings, trying to create his own style of swordsmanship. However, at present, he was genuinely enjoying the process and putting in sincere effort, which was why he refused to allow himself to give up. He also stated firmly that he did not consider it a waste of time. Suddenly, Rio grabbed Khalil by the collar and pulled him close, striking him with a headbutt. Khalil fell backward from the impact. Rio warned him not to try to make him give up by comparing him to himself. He accused Khalil of being clever enough to undermine other people's efforts by telling them to simply find another path. Rio added that Khalil should first create his own one-arm swordsmanship before lecturing others in that way. Khalil understood what Rio meant and began to laugh. Rio felt slightly intimidated by him at that moment. Khalil was reminded of his past, of the day he lost his arm, when the walls blocking his path had already been high and only grew higher. He recalled giving up, believing he would never overcome them, and becoming a half-hearted person. Every time he looked at his empty sleeve, he felt as though he had lost everything. But now, he realized why he had been unable to meet Ryo's eyes, because those eyes clearly showed that Ryo had not given up and had not lost everything. Khalil noticed that only moments earlier, his remaining hand had been holding a piece of wood, and he could hardly believe that Ryo was now lecturing him. He also realized that he was still capable of holding a sword. Ryo then stated that although Khalil claimed he had no talent, Ryo believed Khalil did possess talent, specifically the talent to guide others in sword training. He admitted that most of Khalil's advice had been genuinely helpful to him. Ryo extended his hand to help Khalil up. Khalil remarked that his advice had been for Ryo to give up on mastering the sword, which Ryo had clearly ignored. Ryo then wondered aloud whether Khalil had meant giving up on mastering the dojo's traditional swordsmanship specifically. Khalil stated that if Ryo was fine with being a half-wit, then he would continue giving him advice. Ryo merely smirked and replied that he thought Khalil had already graduated from being a half-wit himself. After that exchange, the tension between them eased, and things finally settled down. Ryo then remarked that Khalil was not acting like his usual self and wondered if something was troubling him. Khalil thought that he already appeared enough like a bad guy and considered letting the matter go. However, he eventually admitted that he had originally been watching only to kill time. But after observing Ryo, he began to see his younger self in him and felt that Ryo reminded him of how miserable he once was. Ryo responded that he already knew that and that Khalil had simply been taking his frustrations out on him. Realizing this, Khalil felt remorseful and apologized to Ryo. A week had passed during which Ryo and Khalil practiced swordsmanship regularly, while Shiraa watched them as a spectator. During one of their sessions, Khalil remarked that Ryo had improved significantly and seemed to have mastered the basic forms. Ryo responded teasingly, saying that he was not used to hearing such praise from Khalil and wondered what had gotten into him. Despite his light tone, Ryo felt uneasy and admitted that even if he had learned the basic forms, they were still very different from formal school training. He doubted whether this practice would truly make a difference. Khalil replied that the training was not pointless at all and explained that it actually suited Ryo's strengths. He pointed out that people blessed with superior physique and raw power often relied heavily on those advantages. However, since Ryo lacked such natural gifts, he was forced to observe his opponents carefully, anticipate their movements, and react accordingly. Khalil added that Ryo's sharp perception and quick reflexes allowed him to handle unpredictable situations and compensate for his lack of physical strength. Ryo felt genuinely intimidated, largely because Khalil could be unpredictable and borderline reckless. Khalil, clearly annoyed, told Ryo to stop overthinking and simply stand still so he could land a hit on him. He remarked that whenever Ryo tried to be serious, he always seemed lost in his own thoughts. Khalil then asked what the defining characteristics of the ox style were. Ryo explained that the style was mostly used by adults who wore heavy-duty armor, and that its fighting method relied on keeping one's feet firmly planted on the ground. Khalil was surprised and asked where Ryo had learned all of this. Ryo replied that he had read it in books and practiced secretly. Khalil then questioned whether Ryo truly believed Yudo was the type of person who would conduct preliminary research before a fight. Ryo denied it, to which Khalil responded that even small details could matter. Khalil suggested that they continue the discussion indoors. As they went inside, he noticed that Shiraa had dozed off and looked cold. At that moment, someone approached them, announcing his arrival as he entered. It was an especially cold day, and Ryo was shocked to see the man wrapped tightly in an overcoat. He immediately alerted Khalil that someone was there. Khalil, however, remained calm and remarked that Furao had finally arrived. Furao joined them and learned about the upcoming Spring Festival. Ryo added that they had been discussing how to deal with the ox style. Furao commented that the style was indeed very powerful. Ryo then revealed that Yudo had learned basic sword handling from Mirren, which was why he would struggle if Yudo chose to use that style. Furao reassured him, saying that there was no need to worry, as the ox style was extremely difficult to master. Khalil agreed, adding that the style focused on fully understanding and utilizing the body's natural strength. Ryo chose not to mention Mirren, as he still felt a shiver run down his spine whenever he remembered how unsettling Mirren had seemed when they first met at his house. He reasoned that there was a good chance Mirren had simply been that kind of person. Instead, Ryo brushed it off, saying it was nothing, and then asked how long Furao planned to stay. Furao replied that he was only there to observe how things were progressing and that he would be staying for around 3 days. Hearing that, Ryo asked him to guide and advise him during that time. After that, Ryo left the place with Shiraa, holding her hand as they walked away. Shiraa remarked that she was genuinely glad that Ryo and Khalil had reconciled. She clarified that she would not exactly call it making up, but rather a truce. Still, she noted that Ryo seemed to have enjoyed himself quite a lot. Ryo agreed with her observation. Shiraa then asked when he planned to make up with Mirren as well. Ryo questioned why she brought that up, and she replied that he had behaved very strangely when they were at Mirren's house. Ryo explained that he had merely been surprised by something at the time. He then realized that Shiraa had noticed more than he had expected. Changing the subject, he commented that it was getting cold and suggested that they hurry back home. Shiraa agreed. When they finally reached home, Shiraa mentioned that Ryo had not shown her any of his precious belongings. Ryo, slightly confused, explained that he preferred to keep his valuables hidden because he did not want them to be damaged or lost. Shiraa thought about this quietly, wondering if Ryo was still keeping something important to himself. 2 months passed, and the scene shifted to the day of the Spring Festival. The streets were filled with arranged stalls, roaming peddlers, and crowds of people. Observing the lively atmosphere, Ryo remarked that spring had truly arrived. Shiraa brought him a piece of cake, which he accepted with thanks. He then recalled that, if he remembered correctly, Rakdoi and Khalil were scheduled to have the first mock battle. At that moment, Khalil suddenly smacked the back of Ryo's head, causing Ryo to shout at him in annoyance. Khalil laughed and told him to make sure he watched the match properly. Others nearby began to murmur, wondering if the event was finally about to begin. Soon after, Khalil and Rakdoi stood facing each other, ready to begin their mock battle. Khalil examined Rakdoi's armor and remarked that Rakdoi was clearly overgeared for what was supposed to be a simple mock battle. Rakdoi responded that there was no such thing as being overgeared. He added that even though Khalil was no longer an active adventurer, he still held a C-rank status, which meant he was not an opponent Rakdoi could afford to underestimate. Khalil reacted casually, maintaining a relaxed attitude as he said that he was simply hoping Rakdoi might lower his guard. Soon after, the match between the two was about to begin. Ryo watched with clear anticipation, looking forward to the battle. At that moment, he noticed Mirren standing beside him. Mirren commented that it looked like an interesting match and said that he doubted Ryo would be surprised by it. When Ryo turned toward him, Mirren greeted both Ryo and Shiraa. Several people nearby glanced in Mirren's direction, prompting Ryo to remark that Mirren seemed to be quite popular. Mirren replied that it was unrelated to the situation, but added that he was far from an average man, especially considering the well-trained physiques around them. As the conversation shifted toward Yudo, Yudo could be seen standing at a short distance, wearing armor and smirking confidently as he told his friends that he had learned everything from his instructor. Mirren quietly wished that Yudo would correct his attitude. Soon after, attention returned to the arena as the match between Khalil and Rakdoi officially began. The village chief stepped forward and announced that the battle had now started. Rakdoi wore full protective gear, including head protection similar to that of a knight. In contrast, Khalil wore minimal armor. As the fight progressed, Ryo observed Khalil's movements carefully. He noticed that Khalil kept moving toward Rakdoi's right side, even though it did not seem like an ideal position. Ryo quickly realized that Khalil was deliberately targeting a specific weakness. This reminded Ryo of an earlier conversation, back when he had been sitting nearby while Shiraa played with snow. At that time, Khalil had explained the Ox-style battle method, which was designed around group formations. Because of those formations, fighters using that style were vulnerable to attacks from the right, and their heavy equipment slowed them down significantly. Ryo realized that if someone could exploit those two weaknesses, they would have a much better chance of winning. Ryo understood that Khalil already had the advantage due to his calculated approach. He also believed that Khalil could use his superior speed to overwhelm his opponent. However, one thing continued to trouble Ryo. Rakdoi, who was supposed to be a defensive fighter, looked unusually calm. It felt as though Rakdoi was waiting for the perfect moment. Suddenly, Rakdoi launched an attack, forcing Khalil to step back. Khalil, however, managed to dodge the follow-up strike as well. People standing behind Ryo commented that it had been a clean dodge, and that Rakdoi had briefly gained the upper hand. Ryo, however, recognized Rakdoi's second attack as a technique from the Ox style. He recalled that it involved leaning backward while channeling strength into the sword, and that even if the strike failed to connect, it carried a high chance of forcing the opponent to retreat. Ryo knew the technique would be troublesome for Khalil and wondered how he planned to counter it with his current condition. Supporters from both sides filled the area, cheering loudly. Someone jokingly shouted that Khalil would have to buy drinks if he lost. Khalil found the noise overwhelming, but he acknowledged inwardly that this was typical of a defensive specialist's fighting style: slow, heavy, and relentless. Rakdoi, meanwhile, remained remarkably calm throughout the exchange. Khalil's hands were still numb from the first strike, and he knew that if he was hit by the same kind of attack again, the fight would be over. His stamina was nearly exhausted, and he was already close to his limit. Despite that, he refused to lose confidence and urged himself to give it his all. As the fight continued, the audience began to realize that Khalil was no longer able to dodge Rakdoi's attacks as freely as before. Gathering what strength he had left, Khalil steadied himself and drove his sword into the ground for support. Tightening his grip, he used the leverage to deliver a kick to Rakdoi's body, forcing him to step back. However, Rakdoi quickly regained balance, countered smoothly, and knocked Khalil down before striking him in the chest with his sword. With that, the outcome was decided, and Rakdoi was declared the winner. Khalil stood up afterward and accepted his defeat, admitting that he had not expected Rakdoi to incorporate elements of the Iden Enro style. Rakdoi responded that if Khalil had been able to use both of his arms properly, he believed he would have been the one lying on the ground instead. Khalil then asked if Rakdoi wanted another round. Rakdoi agreed confidently, stating that he would win again regardless. The crowd applauded loudly, praising the fight and acknowledging the performance of both fighters. Mirren explained that there was a particular style Khalil often used, one that relied heavily on complex footwork, though it required specific preparations to execute properly. Rio listened with curiosity as Mirren continued, adding that it was less a refined style and more of a thug's technique, as it focused on killing on sight. Mirren remarked that Rio clearly carried Khalil's influence and encouraged him to maintain it, expressing confidence that Yudo would eventually grow to dislike Rio as well. He suggested leaving things as they were, noting that even if not everyone noticed, the battle had been well-matched and fair. Rio agreed with this assessment. Mirren then turned his attention back to his students, explaining that he needed to make preparations. Before leaving, he told Rio to do his best. Rio observed that there was no trace of Mirren's earlier unpleasantness. He then asked Shiraa to head back with him. Rio later approached Khalil to praise him for the battle. Khalil responded by saying that Rio's own match was next and advised him to give it his all. Rio replied that it was usually the one struggling at the end who said such things. Khalil wondered if Rio was facing any problems and admitted that he had been quite desperate earlier. Rio said he understood and added that it was thanks to Khalil that he had learned so much. He concluded by stating that he intended to win using his own style. After some time, as they exchanged glances, Yudo approached them and remarked sarcastically that he was surprised Rio had not run away. He mockingly suggested that perhaps Rio was simply a loser or a slacker and claimed that Rio could still run off with his tail tucked between his legs. Rio responded calmly and respectfully, asking why Yudo did not focus on getting himself ready instead. Enraged by the reply, Yudo insulted Rio, calling him worthless and telling him to remember his place. They both stepped onto the battlefield, where the chief asked whether they were ready. With no further delay, he announced the start of the second battle between Yudo and Rio. As the match began, Rio pointed his sword straight ahead, while Yudo raised his weapon toward the sky. For a moment, neither of them moved. The spectators grew confused, wondering what was happening. Khalil, however, understood Rio's intention. The people of the village had never truly seen Rio's swordsmanship, and most of them believed his training to be nothing more than childish nonsense. Khalil wondered what their reactions would be if Rio demonstrated that he could wield a sword properly. As the silence continued, the curiosity of the crowd steadily grew, and many began to question whether Rio was far stronger than they had expected. Yudo grew irritated, suspecting that Rio was deliberately using him to show off his abilities. He wondered whether Rio was trying to imitate Khalil's fighting style, or whether he was simply too frightened to make the first move. Yudo decided that if Rio continued to hesitate, he would strike first. When Yudo finally launched his opening attack, the audience became excited, eager to see how the clash would unfold. Rio easily dodged the strike and immediately countered with his own attack, but Yudo managed to block it. Yudo remarked that Rio had improved significantly since their last encounter and acknowledged his growth with faint praise. Rio was uncertain whether he could break through Yudo's stance. Even after strengthening his body, Yudo still held the advantage in both size and raw strength. Realizing this, Rio focused on devising a way to lure him into making a mistake. He noticed the slight tilt of Yudo's sword to the right and anticipated a diagonal slash. As expected, Yudo launched the attack, but Rio evaded it calmly, recognizing the move as part of an AUX-style technique that relied on following the flow immediately after a previous strike. Ryo realized that the attack was meant to pressure him with continuous motion, but he managed to evade it cleanly. As Yudo grew increasingly frustrated, his attacks became more reckless. The spectators commented on how beautiful Ryo's evasions were, with some recalling that he had never even attended formal dojo classes. Amid the exchange, Ryo calmly reminded Yudo not to lose his concentration. Baldo was shocked by what he witnessed, and Ryo understood his reaction. Baldo had already realized that Ryo's true objective was to demonstrate his own style of swordsmanship to everyone, and that alone was enough to satisfy him. Unfortunately, Yudo was not wearing a helmet, allowing Ryo to clearly see every emotion reflected on his face. Seeing this, Ryo apologized to Yudo in advance and stated that he would be the one to win the match. Yudo grew furious and declared that he was not going to let Ryo win. As he raised his sword, he announced that both of them already knew who the true winner would be. He swung his blade down at Ryo with full force, but before the strike could land, Ryo dodged it with ease. As he moved aside, Ryo reflected that compared to Rakdoi, Yudo's attacks lacked sharpness and precision, and his angles were poorly calculated. In simple terms, Yudo had only learned how to wield a sword, not how to truly master it. Whether a technique had been fully mastered or not made a significant difference, and merely knowing how to swing a blade was not enough. Ryo recognized the familiar pattern in Yudo's movements, and once again, he avoided the next attack without difficulty. Yudo grew increasingly irritated by this. Eventually, their swords clashed directly, and Yudo accused Ryo of secretly observing him during his training sessions. Ryo calmly replied that studying one's opponent was only natural. He added that if Yudo truly believed Ryo had done nothing all this time, then Yudo should question himself instead. Ryo bluntly remarked that Yudo should put in more effort rather than waiting to be spoon-fed knowledge. Enraged by the response, Yudo attacked again, shouting at Ryo to be quiet. Ryo was reminded of his training with Khalil, during which Khalil had pointed out the flaws of flashy ox-style techniques. Ryo acknowledged internally that Yudo needed to prove his superiority to satisfy his pride. He was certain that Yudo would soon resort to a flashy move, one that would be easy for everyone watching to understand. Ryo stated that if he countered Yudo's flashy techniques, it would become obvious to everyone that he was the superior fighter. Khalil remarked that Ryo was truly thinking things through. In response, Ryo said that, as far as he knew, there were two possible approaches. Khalil was curious about this, and Ryo explained that the first was a basic technique in which he would wind up his opponent's sword and then charge while they were left defenseless. He believed the spectators would find it flashy to watch one of the contender's weapons being knocked away. Ryo added that he could manage this method as long as he remained careful about the direction of Yudo's applied force. Khalil explained that the other technique was one that specialized purely in offense during group battles. He noted that while it could be combined with the first technique, it required coordination, and if both sides understood what was coming, it could not be effectively used in a one-on-one fight. Ryo reflected that, hypothetically, this was true. He stopped overthinking it and instead focused on the possibility that if his opponent did not fully understand the technique, he could attempt to connect the two methods. After Yudo delivered a heavy slash, Ryo stepped back and planted his feet firmly, using his leg grip to steady himself. Yudo assumed that Ryo had endured the blow using sheer physical strength, but in reality, Ryo was clinging to his sword with all his might to keep it from being knocked away, still recovering from the impact. Seeing this, Yudo grew confident and declared that victory was now his. He rushed forward aggressively, mocking Ryo and calling him a loser. Ryo, however, remained calm. He had always been in the habit of observing and thinking, and he noticed that Yudo's thrusting posture was different. The difference lay in the distance, the length of the strike, and how Yudo positioned his body. Ryo observed the way Yudo moved his arm, the direction of his feet, the shift in his line of sight, and the change in his center of gravity. He realized that Yudo was leaning forward, putting all his weight into the strike and charging recklessly without considering the consequences. This reminded Ryo of the technique Khalil had taught him, a fast and overwhelming maneuver that was nearly impossible to handle in group combat when opponents pressed forward like a wall. However, that strength vanished when there was no one to support the attacker. As Yudo's strike closed in, Ryo sidestepped at the last moment and struck Yudo's sword with his own. In that instant, Ryo felt everything with unnatural clarity. The sound of flags fluttering in the wind, the cheers of the crowd, the vibration of the sword, the shift in Yudo's balance, and even the movement of his eyes. Yudo's motions appeared slower and clearer than they ever had during training. With Yudo's stance broken and no allies to cover for him, Ryo focused on the most crucial part of his movement. He struck Yudo's leg cleanly, causing him to lose balance and fall. Ryo reminded himself not to lower his guard until the very end, knowing that pride often caused fighters to overextend themselves. Moments later, the chief announced that the winner of the match was Ryo. A few days after the mock battle, Ryo's life gradually returned to normal. One day, while he was practicing swordsmanship, his father called out to him and said that the two of them needed to visit the village chief's house. Ryo followed quietly, thinking that some people had likely surpassed Yudo and begun receiving direct instruction. However, he also felt that an increase in such attention could be counterproductive if it led to more slackers relying on favoritism rather than effort. When they arrived at the village chief's house and entered, Ryo noticed that the chief was already seated with Rakdoi and Khalil. The chief asked Ryo to take a seat. Ryo complied and politely asked what the matter was. The village chief first congratulated him on his performance in the mock battle, admitting that the outcome had been unexpected. He added that the match had been impressive and sincerely apologized for forcing Ryo to participate. After that, the chief presented a sword to Ryo. Khalil explained that it was a high-quality weapon, properly forged in a workshop. The chief mentioned that he had asked Baldo what would be appropriate as an apology, which led Khalil and Rakdoi to consult on the direction of the workshop and the design of the final product. Rakdoi added that the sword had been made using input from everyone involved and remarked that Ryo's composure and adaptability until the very end of the battle had been exceptional, which he considered a compliment. Ryo bowed slightly to express his gratitude. Rakdoi continued by saying that they were quite proud of the sword and suggested that Ryo try handling it. As Ryo reached out to take it, his father stopped him and stated that if Ryo accepted the sword, he would be treated as an adult. He added that Ryo would be expected to use his power responsibly. Ryo suddenly clenched his fist and asked his father whether he had remained silent all this time just to say that now. His father became visibly angry but told Ryo to take the sword anyway, saying that it would be fine and that Ryo had already decided how he would use his strength from the beginning. Rakdoi then remarked that it was unfortunate, saying that he knew Ryo had rejected him before, but asked once again whether Ryo would consider returning to the dojo. Ryo replied that Rakdoi already knew the answer, that he intended to create his own swordsmanship. He still thanked Rakdoi for the offer. Afterward, Ryo returned home, reflecting that he never expected to be entrusted with something so expensive, and that he could not treat it casually. When he entered the house, Shiraa welcomed him and moved to take the basket from his hands, but she noticed injuries on his hand. Ryo brushed it off, saying it was nothing unusual. However, Shiraa firmly took hold of him, reminding him that he had said the other day that he would keep his precious things safe. She added that she did not like seeing him hurt. Ryo replied that if that were the case, he would stop his sword training altogether. Shiraa responded that he should speak with his father first. At that moment, Baldo called out to Ryo for help and informed everyone that Yudo had gone into the mountains again. A meeting was quickly convened, and concern spread among those present. The chief stated that, at the very least, Yudo was currently unharmed. Soon after, Yudo himself was brought before them. Ryo thought that they had found him surprisingly fast and quietly asked Khalil where Yudo had been discovered. Khalil replied that Mirren had found him. Hearing that name, Ryo thought to himself that Mirren had once again become involved. The village chief scolded Yudo harshly, reminding him that he had already been severely warned the last time. He demanded to know why Yudo had once again entered the mountains without permission. Yudo hesitated before answering, then explained that he had grown frustrated after Ryo received a sword and was acknowledged as a full-fledged adult. He admitted that this had made him feel left behind, and he believed that if he could achieve something great, such as defeating an evil beast, he would earn praise from everyone as well. Ryo felt an unsettling sense of discomfort upon hearing this explanation. Shiraa also commented on the situation, noting that Mirren had mentioned something similar earlier. Ryo tried to calm himself, reasoning that the first time Yudo had gone into the mountains, it might have been driven by genuine curiosity. However, this time, Yudo spoke as if the decision had been caused by external pressure rather than his own will, and even after being scolded before, his motives now seemed vague and poorly defined. Another troubling thought crossed Ryo's mind. Both times, Yudo had been found very easily by Mirren. Moreover, the unease Ryo felt around Yudo earlier was the same strange discomfort he associated with Mirren. Ryo began to suspect that Mirren might be using some form of magic, possibly to locate people or subtly influence their actions, but he could not understand the purpose behind it. Ryo quietly called Khalil and mentioned that he had previously asked Furao about Mirren's name not appearing in the guild registry. Khalil replied that Furao was supposed to receive a report involving Mirren around autumn, but no response had arrived even through winter. He added that he was certain the report would surface eventually. Just as Khalil was about to question Rio further, he realized that Rio had already left. Rio concluded that Mirren's absence from the meeting meant he had already noticed Rio's suspicion. Deciding there was no point in waiting any longer, Rio resolved to confront Mirren directly. As he made his way through the village, he encountered Mirren along the path. Rio greeted him politely. Mirren, wearing his overcoat, turned toward Rio and returned the greeting, remarking calmly that it was a very lovely night. Rio asked Mirren why he was in such a place. Mirren casually replied that he was simply passing through. Rio remarked that Mirren seemed unusually calm and asked whether he had something to hide. In response, Mirren opened his hands and said that he had nothing to conceal at the moment. Rio noticed that Mirren's movements felt unnatural. He realized he was at an advantage, as Mirren was unarmed, and decided that he needed to choose his actions carefully. Mirren then commented that, unlike Yudo, Rio observed situations carefully and thought things through, which he found admirable. He suggested that they refrain from fighting and instead enjoy a conversation. Mirren also questioned why Rio believed that he was responsible for all the trouble. Rio replied that he had noticed certain patterns earlier. He felt it was too much of a coincidence that the first time Mirren encountered Yudo, nothing happened, and the second time, Yudo returned again without having attacked him. Mirren countered by asking what Rio would say if it were merely another coincidence. He explained that Yudo had been searching for the evil beast in the third swamp area, and had told Mirren that he was looking for a way to get back at Rio. Rio responded that if that was the case, there was nothing he could do, especially since Yudo himself had said that everyone would start looking at him as though he was no longer the same person. Based on this, Rio formed two possibilities, one involving manipulative magic and another involving magic that made people believe lies. While the second idea seemed far-fetched, Rio concluded, based on Yudo's behavior and words, that Mirren might be manipulating impressions rather than emotions, making the latter possibility more likely. Mirren laughed and praised Rio, calling him a remarkable child. He then admitted that he had lied about not being registered with the guild, revealing that he had never registered in the first place. This, he explained, was why he had been planning to leave before the truth became obvious. Rio wondered whether there was something Mirren needed Yudo to do in the mountains and whether Mirren had set a trap there during the first search. He questioned what Mirren was truly planning. Mirren responded that it was top secret and remarked that Rio had developed an impressive habit of observing and thinking carefully. He added that if he had wanted to, he could have been the first to find Rio when he was lost and could have turned that into a memory. Rio then asked for a break. Mirren refused and coldly stated that he killed people to collect their belongings, calling those acts his memories. Mirren smiled and said that Rio was right. He admitted that he was genuinely pleased that Rio had noticed, adding that he had never expected Rio to understand his habits so clearly. He explained that he did not directly commit the acts himself. Instead, he looked forward to collecting the belongings afterward. As he examined them and reminisced, he felt a strong sense of excitement and satisfaction. Mirren then laughed. Rio wondered whether Mirren was joking. Even if he understood what Mirren meant, he neither agreed with it nor sympathized, and he thought Mirren was completely out of his mind. Mirren readily agreed, saying that he was someone who preferred beautiful memories. He also remarked that there could be an interesting scenario involving disciplining the troublesome Yudo together with Rio. Rio then questioned whether Mirren intended to kill him as well. Mirren merely smiled and replied that it would be a shame to kill Rio. Instead, he proposed that the next time they met, they would fight seriously, intending to kill each other with everything they had. He added that by then, Rio would most likely have perfected his swordsmanship. Rio stated that he did not want to see Mirren again. Mirren responded lightly, telling him not to be so dull, and pointed out that Rio was currently unarmed and that the village itself could use assistance, making the idea not entirely unreasonable. Rio replied that Mirren did not realize he intended to report everything to the chief. He added that if the matter reached the lords, it would not be easy for Mirren to escape. Mirren said he did not mind, but he believed there was no point in searching for him. If it came to that, he claimed he could simply make people believe a lie and overwrite the truth. Rio then warned him to be prepared, as his neck would be on the line. Mirren turned away, saying that it seemed they had a deal. He added that Rio should know that they were the ones behind the evil beast incident. With that revelation, Mirren left the place. As Mirren left, Rio felt unsettled that he had been able to sit so close to him despite being terrified. After some time, he stood up, deciding that the first thing he needed to do was report everything to his father and the others. He eventually returned to them and explained everything that had happened. They all understood the gravity of the situation. The chief said that they would inform the lord and everyone in the village about Mirren, including the fact that he had already left. He added that they could only hope Rio had not been affected by Mirren's magic. Rio replied that he did not think that was the case, explaining that Mirren had said he wanted to make memories of him. And for that to happen, Rio needed to clearly remember everything that had occurred. The chief concluded that, regardless of the situation, they would simply act based on what they knew. Khalil stretched his body and remarked that it likely meant Mirren had affected them to some extent as well, which would be troubling if it became evident. Baldo added that everyone needed to stay alert and run immediately if they sensed danger, just as Shiraa had called out earlier. At that moment, the tone of the conversation shifted to something calmer and more polite. Shiraa then announced that she wanted to train with the sword like Rio. Everyone was shocked by her declaration. Over the next few days, she actively practiced swordsmanship while Rio and Khalil watched. Khalil commented that Shiraa's movements looked almost like a dance. Rio wondered whether she was naturally talented and realized that, in several ways, she might be even more gifted than he was, as she seemed to instinctively understand how to move her body. What surprised him the most was how unusually compatible she was with strengthening techniques. Rio admitted that he was astonished by Shiraa's talent. Khalil explained that because she spread her magic evenly, she could amplify strengthening far more effectively. He added that even back when he traveled from dojo to dojo, he had never seen anyone as skilled as Shiraa. This made him consider whether he should teach her the enro style. Saad objected immediately, saying that he had heard the style was extremely dangerous and urged Khalil to abandon the idea. Khalil then remarked that Rio's footwork had been changing. Rio replied that he had expected Khalil to notice. He explained that after watching Khalil's mock matches, he had been thinking deeply about how one move connected to the next and had realized how crucial that flow was. He said he was still experimenting, not only with offensive movement, but also with techniques that could be used to escape. Khalil then wondered aloud whether Rio had been holding something back, mentioning that he had heard Rio had gotten into a scuffle with Yudo's group. Rio hesitated before recalling the incident when Yudo had poured something over Shiraa's head, accusing Rio of being the reason he was restricted from going out and blaming everything on him. Yudo had mocked Shiraa, saying she was as unresponsive as ever and that it was no fun to pick on her. Rio had stepped in at that moment and struck Yudo. Stopping his recollection, Rio noticed Khalil's reaction as Khalil wondered aloud how Rio had managed to face 3 opponents and receive only a stern warning, while the others had been given a proper suspension. Rio replied that he had ignored them at first, but he could not forgive Yudo for shifting his target from him to Shiraa, who could not even fight back. Rio admitted that he knew it was wrong to hit Yudo, but he believed that if he had let him act freely, Shiraa would have continued to be targeted. Khalil responded that no matter what others might say, if someone crossed a line, it was only natural to retaliate. He added that Rio should have spoken to him first. Rio agreed, saying that if he were in Khalil's place, he would have done the same thing at least once. At that moment, Lamini arrived with another girl and explained that her father had said she was going into the mountains for a short hunt. She added that Rio and Shiraa were expected to come along as well. As they entered the forest, Rio asked Lamini how long the hunt would last. Lamini replied that it would only be for the day and that whatever they caught would be smoked afterward. She also mentioned that there were 4 hunters in total. As Rio watched, he noticed Lamini shooting birds in a precise manner, aiming only at their wings so they could not fly, capturing them without killing them. He observed that they were catching more birds but had not encountered any other animals yet. This made him wonder whether the influence of the evil beast was still lingering. He glanced at Lamini's father, who remained as silent as ever. Shiraa then called out to Rio, asking whether he was not going to pick the fruits growing nearby. Rio immediately warned her not to touch them, reminding her that although they looked similar to fumago berries used for winter storage, they were poisonous. Shiraa replied that there were signs that something had already eaten them. Upon closer inspection, Rio noticed the same marks, leading them to suspect that a large beast might be nearby. Rio found the situation unsettling, as bears and deer naturally avoided those berries, while monkeys and humans would become nauseous after eating even one. He had also heard that consuming 2 could stop a person's heart altogether. There were no known beasts that could safely consume large quantities of those berries. Lamini then called out to her friend, pointing ahead and asking him to look carefully. Rio sensed something was wrong. Lamini said that something appeared to be moving in the distance. After focusing more carefully, Rio stated that it was not a monkey. Others suggested approaching for a closer look, but Rio hesitated. From afar, he could not clearly see the details, but the creature's build reminded him of a bear, and the atmosphere surrounding it felt ominous. He realized that it matched the description of a petal-type evil beast. Rio concluded that if his suspicion was correct, they were already in a dangerous position. He insisted that while it was still far away, they needed to return to the village immediately, as it might be a new type of evil beast. After everyone returned, Rio gathered the group and reported that they had seen something in the woods that resembled an evil beast. His father reacted with surprise and said that something similar had been spotted in the forest behind their workshop as well. Rio was startled by this and wondered aloud whether the creature had appeared near their work area too. His father agreed and said that the matter needed to be addressed immediately. Khalil supported the idea and asked a few people to come to his house to discuss it further. Once they had gathered there, they began planning. Baldo mentioned that they had seen the creature in the shallow part of the woods behind the village. Rio added that he had spotted one near a cluster of frau berries. He estimated that the sighting had occurred about 30 minutes earlier, roughly the time it would take to return to the village. He also noted that the creature appeared larger than his father and walked on two legs, suggesting that it might be a new species. Rio's father said that they had seen what appeared to be the same creature around the same time, and that its appearance matched Rio's description. He briefly wondered whether this meant there were two of them, but another man disagreed, stating that there were likely more. Rio supported this claim, explaining that according to what he had read, there were no known beasts in the area capable of eating frau berries, and this fact did not change even if a beast became an evil one. Considering the quantity of berries being consumed, he believed there was a strong possibility that this was a new species that had come from elsewhere. One man questioned whether this meant that creatures were transforming into evil beasts as a group, and pointed out how alarming it was that they could digest those berries. Rio then asked Khalil for his opinion, specifically what might cause such a transformation. Khalil said that since he had not seen the creature in person, he could not be certain, but he suggested that it might be human in origin. The chief was shocked and said that he had not heard of any missing people in the area. However, he recalled that there had been one unidentified individual wandering in the mountains. At the same time, everyone knew that humans could not normally eat those berries. Rio pointed out that if someone possessed the right knowledge, they might be able to detoxify the berries before consuming them. Baldo then asked whether Rio was suggesting that a human could have turned into an evil beast while retaining human knowledge. Khalil said he could not confirm such a thing, but admitted it was possible. He added that if a bandit or drifter had transformed into an evil beast, it would make the situation far more dangerous and difficult to handle. Rio urged the chief to set up defenses for the village as soon as possible and to prepare for the worst-case scenario, especially if an intelligent group attacked the village with hostile intent. He also wondered whether Mirren's magic might have influenced them, whether they were human or evil beasts. If that were the case, he concluded, a conflict would be inevitable. Khalil agreed with Rio's opinion, stating that since they did not know whether the beast would actually attack, it was best to prepare in advance. Rio looked at Khalil as he continued, explaining that if Mirren was involved, they had to consider the possibility of an attack on the village. He added that if it were a single evil beast, as was usually the case, it would not pose much of a problem given the village's strength. However, since there appeared to be more than one beast this time, proper preparation was necessary. Baldo suggested that evacuation was also an option, but Khalil rejected the idea, citing the limited time frame and lack of sufficient resources. He stated that the wisest course of action would be to call for reinforcements and prepare for a siege until help arrived. The village chief agreed with this plan and ordered immediate siege preparations, after which the entire village began working. While Rio was digging, Khalil approached him and asked him to return to the rear. He explained that the main defense at the rear would consist of himself, Rio, and a few selected men. Those capable of using bows and arrows were assigned as support units and positioned there as well. At the front, Rakdoi, the other adults, and the disciples were stationed. Khalil asked Rio how the front lines were holding up. Rio replied that Rakdoi was leading effectively and that the adults seemed steady, though the disciples were somewhat divided. Khalil expressed hope that they would cooperate properly when the time came. At the rear of the village, Khalil instructed everyone to bring in the wood shavings, explaining that they would be used as torches. He remarked that the rear defenses were weaker than the front, but despite being hastily prepared, they were still acceptable. Rio then asked whether Khalil had reported the situation to the guild. Khalil confirmed that he had, but added that reinforcements would not arrive until the next day at the earliest. As they were about to continue the discussion, they suddenly heard a noise coming from the forest. A man rushed over and reported that a huge bipedal monkey had appeared. Rio thought that the timing was far too soon. As the monster drew closer, the man anxiously asked what they should do and whether they truly had to fight it. Khalil told him to remain calm, explaining that they were not yet properly equipped to engage in battle. The man decided to retreat and inform the people stationed at the front. Khalil agreed with the decision and then asked Rio what he thought about the situation. Rio replied that it seemed like a reconnaissance move or a warning, suggesting that the enemy could strike at any moment. Khalil wondered whether the creature's appearance matched what Rio had seen earlier in the forest. Rio replied that it looked roughly the same. Hearing this, Khalil remarked that the assumption of the creatures being mere evil beasts was slowly fading. He pointed out that while appearance and size mattered, the waist armor worn by the bipedal monkey was poorly made. He added that if it were something crafted by humans, even if made of wood, it would have shown far more care and refinement. Rio agreed and added that their earlier unfounded concerns were easing now, as it was clear that the enemy had come only for reconnaissance. Khalil then stated that the real issue was the level of intelligence they were dealing with, which made the situation far more troublesome. Rio responded by telling Khalil that they needed to work out a plan and that they might be able to use the intelligence of the bipedal monkeys against them. The next day, while Rio was resting at his guard post, Shiraa arrived carrying a bag. She thanked him and asked whether the fern tea was all right. Rio replied that it was extremely bitter. Shiraa asked if he was doing fine, and Rio assured her that everything was fine since they were taking turns on watch. Suddenly, both of them heard a high-pitched sound. When they looked around, they noticed that none of the others seemed to have heard it. Rio and Shiraa immediately went to Khalil and reported the emergency, explaining that they had heard a strange sound. Rio added that only he, Shiraa, and the other children were able to hear it, suggesting that it was likely a signal from a commander deep within the forest. Khalil asked them where the sound had come from, and both Rio and Shiraa pointed in the same direction. Around the same time, word arrived from the front that a group of monkeys had been spotted. Khalil agreed with their assessment and ordered everyone to stay alert, stating that since Rio and Shiraa had heard the strange sound, it was probably a signal for a surprise attack. He warned that the enemy could strike from behind as well, using the noise to coordinate their movements. Moments later, a large number of monkeys suddenly emerged from the forest in front of them. Rio quickly told Shiraa to go and find her father. He estimated that there were around 15 of them. However, despite their numerical advantage, Rio could not sense any hidden presence, which made him hesitate, unsure of what the enemy's next move might be. Khalil stated that he wanted to observe how intelligent the monkeys were, noting that they had crafted weapons instead of charging blindly. Rio pointed out that poison had already been applied to the fence. Realizing the situation, Khalil ordered everyone to proceed exactly as planned. He emphasized that if things became dangerous, they were to retreat immediately, as their top priority was to hold out until the guild reinforcements arrived. He further instructed them not to engage the enemies one-on-one as long as they were following the plan. Some of the villagers joked that they knew Khalil only wanted an excuse to drink later. Rio stated that he would follow the plan as well. Khalil warned him not to act like a scaredy cat, to which Rio calmly replied that Khalil himself had acknowledged Rio's abilities. When others arrived asking for their positions, Rio told them to simply follow the plan. Once everyone took their positions, Khalil ordered them to aim at the central group first. Arrows were released, but they caused little damage. Lemony remarked that it was extremely difficult to land accurate shots at night. Rio observed that while the monkeys were startled by the sudden barrage, they did not immediately attack. He suspected that they were communicating with one another. He reasoned that if scouts had already been sent ahead, then someone must be hiding behind the bushes to issue commands. Rio asked Lemony to check the far left side. After observing carefully, she reported that there was another beast of similar size there. Rio immediately ordered the archers to strike the far left target. As they did so, the monkeys at the front rushed to counterattack, which inadvertently freed Lemony from danger. Khalil then charged forward, ordering the archers to fall back and use whistles to disrupt the enemy's coordination. He instructed the combatants to follow him and strike the beasts directly, stating that they would secure victory at the rear. As the plan unfolded, the whistle sounds forced the commander who had been giving orders to reveal himself. At that moment, Rio rushed in and severed the creature's arm. Terrified, the monster attempted to flee, but Rio warned it not to run. He then gathered all his strength in an instant and drove his sword into the monster, killing it decisively. As the others watched, they felt a strange aura emanating from Rio. Seeing their leader fall, the remaining beasts panicked and fled into the mountains. Someone suggested pursuing them, but Khalil stopped the idea, stating that the monsters would not return. He ordered everyone to prioritize tending to the injured and reinforcing the front gate instead. Rio stretched his body and remarked that he was relieved everything had worked out. Khalil approached him, patted him on the shoulder, and expressed his appreciation, saying that Rio deserved a medal for such a well-thought-out plan. Someone else commented that they had expected at least one of the enemies to retreat in order to reduce their numbers, but Khalil admitted that he had not anticipated such an overwhelming result. Their moment of relief was cut short when they suddenly heard a noise coming from the direction of the front gate. Moments later, a man rushed over and reported that a section of the front gate had been breached. Someone wondered whether the monkeys had managed to get inside the gate and questioned how they had even reached that far. A man from the front gate reported that several students had escaped from the area where the monkeys were stationed. He added that thankfully, the enemies had not yet breached the gate, but the long wall had been set on fire. Another person complained that they should be allowed to return home, remarking that Khalil had never mentioned that those evil monkey beasts would go around setting houses ablaze. Others echoed the same concern. Rio considered this carefully, noting that he had never heard of such behavior before. Some villagers began saying that they had heard beasts could transform into humans and might have already infiltrated the front gate. Rio realized that all of this chaos was likely caused by Mirren's magic. Khalil then stated that anyone worried about their families was free to return home, while the rest would be welcomed as support at the front gate. He instructed those heading back to remain vigilant and to protect their neighbors at all costs. After several people left, Rio asked Khalil why he had allowed them to go, explaining that he had expected Khalil to identify and eliminate those who might be under Mirren's influence. Khalil responded by praising Rio, saying that he was a sharp-minded child. Rio then expressed concern that if the situation became as chaotic as before, it would be better to eliminate threats early on. Khalil agreed and suggested that they should aim to take down the enemy commander first, adding that Rio would deliver the decisive strike and that they would adapt their plan as events unfolded. Meanwhile, at the front gate, Rakdoi was locked in battle with a beast and was struggling badly. He realized that the creature possessed immense strength, so much so that he could barely block its attacks even while gripping his weapon with both hands. The beast attempted to strike him repeatedly with a spear, and Rakdoi felt that dodging was nearly impossible. At that critical moment, Khalil arrived and saved him. Khalil ordered Rakdoi to tell the other disciples to retreat, stating that they were only getting in the way. Rakdoi replied that the disciples were already engaged in combat and that ordering them to fall back would only result in them being crushed. Khalil then said that he would draw the monkey's attention himself and instructed Rakdoi to get the students out as quickly as possible. He added that if the situation became unmanageable, he would step in again. Rakdoi agreed, and Khalil explained that he had never meant Rakdoi should ignore the collapsed walls. He said that he had brought in several students as manpower, but the decision had backfired. Khalil added that they would reflect on that mistake later. However, he pointed out that many students were still fighting, which proved that Rakdoi's teaching had not been ineffective. Rakdoi was surprised and asked what Khalil's plan was to break the beast's morale. Khalil replied that there was no guarantee it would work, but he and Rio had come up with a contingency plan. Rio then stepped forward to confront the monkeys and revealed the severed head of their boss from the back gate, declaring that their plan had failed. Rakdoi was shocked and wondered what Rio was doing, fearing that such an action would only cause the enemy to rampage. Khalil, however, told him to wait and watch. Khalil recalled what had happened earlier, when Rio had been carrying the severed head and had said that he understood Khalil wanted to show it to the others, though he had questioned the reason behind it. At that time, Rio had noticed that Lemony's brother, Roman, was following them as well. Rio had asked Roman how the front line had collapsed. Roman replied that several students had escaped and attacked the enemy's weak point. Khalil wondered if that meant there was a leader among the students who had directed them where to strike. Rio questioned whether that would make the enemies less frightened than those at the back. Khalil agreed, but noted that, regardless, it would still be difficult for the beasts to remain calm. Rio hoped the plan would succeed, while Khalil suggested that they first observe the beast's reaction. Rio noticed that he had successfully drawn all their attention toward himself. Even though the monsters could not speak, it was clear they understood. The monsters soon went into a frenzy and began chasing Rio. Rio started running, determined to buy time for the others. He realized that the situation had been created deliberately and that the beasts were in a disturbed mental state. Using this chaos to his advantage, he began searching for their commander. Finally, Ryo spotted the commander slightly farther down the stone wall. The creature had armor wrapped around its belly, marking it clearly as the leader. Rakdoi told Khalil that he would go ahead and scatter the beasts. Khalil agreed and instructed that anyone who was still able to move should help reduce the number of pursuers chasing Ryo, even if only slightly. Ryo slashed through the approaching monsters, and Khalil joined him, stabbing at the beasts as well. Khalil reasoned that they could not allow the enemies to hesitate or retreat and then refocus on Ryo. Rakdoi asked if Khalil was all right, to which Khalil replied that Rakdoi should focus on getting the students back while Ryo held the beasts off. Khalil then gave Ryo a signal, indicating that it was now his turn to act as a decoy and buy time for the others. Ryo drew his sword and swung it at an oncoming beast, delivering several deep cuts before turning to strike another. However, after some time, his strength gave out and he collapsed. Ryo realized it felt just like before, the same physical limitations and the same loss of mana. He had been so absorbed in the fight that he had failed to reinforce his body properly. A beast stood right in front of him, and Ryo desperately tried to move his legs. The others grew anxious for him, but suddenly the beast reacted to a sound, and all of them vanished at once. Rakdoi and Khalil wondered why the enemies had suddenly stopped. Khalil guessed that perhaps the commander had been killed. Ryo struggled to get up, thinking that he had not heard any sound and that there had been no signal from Khalil. He told everyone to stay alert, but before he could say anything more, a beast suddenly grabbed him by the face. In that instant, arrows and spears flew through the air, striking down the beast. Khalil immediately understood that a larger force had arrived. The reinforcements leader ordered the spearmen to fall back and take their positions, placing one unit at the front while sending 3 units Ryo. He also commanded the cavalry to prepare for an advance. The villagers were instructed to take the wounded back inside the gate. From that moment on, the leader announced, the next head of the Roseth Viscount family, Rathmore Roseth, would take command. The battle ended quickly. The knights trampled and cut down the monkeys from horseback, turning them into corpses under the blades of well-coordinated elite forces. Khalil went to Ryo and asked if he was all right. Ryo, still catching his breath, admitted that he was amazed by the way the knights fought. Khalil mockingly called him a self-taught idiot. With that, the monkeys' surprise attack was completely thwarted, and the situation finally came to an end. The scene then shifted to the reception room of the Ox-style Swordsmanship Dojo, where Rathmore was reading the report. He stated that they now understood the steps that had led to the attack and that he wanted to hear their account directly. As Ryo observed Rathmore, he felt that something about him stood out. Rathmore's core felt stable, and his movements were far from ordinary. His well-worn sword and armor suggested extensive combat experience, and Ryo could not help but note that Rathmore was also quite handsome. When Ryo began speaking, Rathmore asked if there was something wrong. Ryo showed proper respect and explained that the monkeys had not only worn armor, but also carried weapons. However, those armed beasts merely swung their weapons wildly, and some even dropped them mid-fight, which suggested they had no real martial training. Rathmore asked whether Ryo had noticed anything else. Ryo agreed, and added that there had been a commander leading the group. He said the monkeys appeared to follow a clear strategy, which made him believe they possessed a certain level of intelligence. Rathmore remarked that Ryo was perceptive and a thoughtful observer. He added that he had heard the commander at the back gate had been defeated by a young man, while the other students had been stationed at the front gate. Ryo explained that this was because he was not a student and had developed his own style of swordsmanship, which was why he had been placed at the back. Rathmore expressed interest in the idea of self-taught swordsmanship and then turned to the village chief, asking whether he had noticed any suspicious groups in the surrounding mountains. He explained that such a group would likely be human and that it had arrived to assist them quickly because he had already been investigating suspicious movements in the area. Before the chief could respond, Khalil raised his hand and spoke on his behalf. He introduced himself as the one responsible for handling guild deliveries and overseeing the area around the village. Rathmore nodded and asked him to continue. Khalil stated that they had not seen any groups of people since the previous autumn. He added that they had conducted investigations in the area due to the beast incidents, but had found no traces of a camp. However, he mentioned one suspicious point he felt needed attention: a self-proclaimed adventurer named Mirren, who had been wandering around and had stayed in the village until a few days earlier. Khalil suggested that Mirren might have been involved in the ambush. Rathmore stated that he had also heard about Midland and asked for Ryo's thoughts on the matter. Rio replied that the situation was extremely tricky. Rathmore then instructed his subordinate to report the situation to his father and inform him that they would return east as soon as the situation in the village was resolved. Rio had already been feeling that Midland was more likely than not to be involved. Rathmore apologized, saying that they should set aside the bad news for the moment, as they could not afford to leave any surviving monkeys roaming freely. He ordered that a few agile individuals from the village, familiar with the mountains, be selected. By the next day, they would conduct a sweep to hunt down any survivors and continue the investigation. Rathmore added that Ogden was scheduled to arrive the following day, but there was no need to wait for him. In the meantime, he intended to assign one villager to each three-man squad. Rio wondered who among the villagers would be chosen. Rathmore then revealed that he wanted Rio to be part of his own squad. The village chief immediately objected, explaining that Rio had yet to receive proper training and that placing him in Rathmore's squad might be disrespectful. Rio himself was frightened, thinking that the consequences of offending a noble could vary greatly, and in the worst case, even lead to execution. The chief further insisted that Rio lacked formal swordsmanship training. Rathmore stood up and stated that such concerns were not a problem for his squad. He approached Rio and added that any rudeness would be offset by Rio's recent achievements, which would go unquestioned. He also said that Rio would have the opportunity to witness the swordsmanship of the Roseth family knights firsthand, making it far from a bad offer. Rathmore concluded that the decision ultimately belonged to Rio. Rio grew nervous, realizing that an invitation from nobility carried both pressure and threat, leaving him feeling torn between the two. Rio decided to let things unfold naturally, and after some time, he finally accepted the offer. Later, a man remarked that Rathmore seemed to be in a good mood, and that he truly intended to take the boy along on the sweep planned for the next day. Rathmore agreed, saying that although Rio appeared a little shaken, he was far more determined than he had initially expected. The man shared the same opinion. Rathmore then looked out the window in Rio's direction, thinking to himself that Rio was a fascinating child.